she was by almost universal agreement the most beloved member of the British royal family of the 20th century. Not the most admired, that was the Queen. Not the most glamorous, that was Diana. Not the most powerful in any formal constitutional sense, that was also the Queen. But the most beloved, in the specific way that the British public extends love to public figures who seem to embody something warm and permanent and unthreatening about the national character, the Queen Mother, the nation's grandmother, the woman who stayed in London during the Blitz, who visited the bombed streets of the East End in her best clothes because she felt the people deserved her best, who smiled through every difficulty with a serenity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than performance. She drank gin, and she loved horses, and she laughed easily, and she lived to 101, and the country mourned her with a sincerity that the managed grief of official occasions rarely produces. The image was one of the most successful constructions in the history of modern monarchy, and it was a construction assembled with a deliberateness and maintained with a discipline that the warmth and the lavender and the corgis were specifically designed to conceal. Behind the image was a woman of formidable intelligence and formidable will who had entered the royal family as a Scottish aristocrat's daughter with a clear understanding of what she wanted and a set of social and political skills precisely calibrated to get it. She had watched her husband nearly destroyed by the institution before she helped him survive it. She had watched her brother-in-law abandon the throne and formed judgments about that abandonment that she prosecuted with remarkable consistency for the next 65 years. She had watched her daughter inherit a burden that she had helped define, and she had managed that daughter's life and choices in ways that served the institution's interest and her own vision of what the monarchy required. She had, in the course of a public life spanning 8 decades, accumulated enemies, not the loud kind. She was far too careful for that. The quiet kind. The kind that accumulate when a woman of genuine power operates in a world that does not acknowledge women's power and therefore cannot defend against it because it cannot see it. The enemies were specific people with specific stories. Wallis Simpson, who she despised with a consistency that outlasted every other emotion of her public life. The Duke of Windsor, her brother-in-law, who she believed had committed a betrayal she never forgave. Lord Mountbatten, whose influence over the royal family she found intolerable and spent decades reducing. Her own daughter Margaret, whose happiness she quietly sacrificed on the altar of institutional necessity. The journalists and biographers who came too close to the truth about her and discovered what happened to people who did. And Diana, the daughter-in-law, whose arrival she assessed with an accuracy that was not kindness, and whose suffering she enabled with the specific mechanism of the withdrawn hand. 6 enemies, 6 campaigns, 6 outcomes. The outcomes were in every case the one she had intended. The story of the Queen Mother's enemies is not a story about a villain. That framing is as wrong as the official one. She was not cruel in the way that people who enjoy cruelty are cruel. She did not take pleasure in the suffering of the people she moved against. She was, in her way, a woman of genuine conviction. She believed in the monarchy with a depth and a consistency that was not merely professional but existential. That defined her understanding of herself and her purpose, and the meaning of everything she had done and sacrificed. The people she destroyed because she believed they threatened the thing she had given her life to. The destroying was, in her framework, not a moral failure but a moral obligation. The smile was not a disguise for something evil. It was the expression of a woman who had fully resolved the tension between what she wanted to do and what she believed she should do, and who had found that the resolution served both simultaneously. That is not a simple thing to be. It is not a comfortable thing to examine, but it is the truth of who she was, and the truth is more interesting than the lavender. It is considerably more interesting than the lavender. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon was born on August 4, 1900, the 9th of 10 children of Claude George Bowes-Lyon, the 14th Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, and his wife Cecilia Nina Cavendish Bentinck. The birth happened at the family's London townhouse, though the world she was formed in was primarily the Scottish one. Glamis Castle in Angus, the ancient seat of the Strathmore family, a place of genuine historical weight and the kind of physical beauty that the Scottish landscape produces when it is at its most deliberately overwhelming. Glamis was not simply a house. It was a statement. It had been in the Bowes-Lyon family since the 14th century, and the specific quality of life it housed, the shooting, the farming, the tenantry relationships, the seasonal rhythms of a landed Scottish estate operating in the way that landed Scottish estates had operated for generations, was a world with its own social logic, its own hierarchies, its own understanding of what mattered and what did not. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon grew up inside that logic, and the specific things it taught her about power and position and the management of other people's perceptions of you were things she carried into every subsequent context of her adult life. The first thing that world taught her was that class is performed rather than simply occupied. The Strathmore family were genuinely aristocratic. The earldom was old, the castle was real, the connection to Scottish history was not invented, but the specific texture of their aristocratic life required constant maintenance. The house needed running, the estate needed managing. The relationships with tenants and local families and neighbouring landowners needed tending in ways that required social intelligence and the specific kind of warm authority that gets people to do what you need them to do without appearing to require it. Elizabeth watched her mother manage all of this with considerable skill, and she absorbed the watching. Her mother, Cecilia, was a woman of strong religious conviction and considerable social competence, and the combination of those two qualities produced a household that was simultaneously warm and ordered, in which the warmth was genuine but the order was never in question. Elizabeth was her mother's favourite in the specific sense that the qualities Cecilia most valued, intelligence, charm, social grace, the ability to make a room feel better by being in it, were the qualities Elizabeth demonstrated most fully. The favouritism was not the blinding kind that produces entitlement. It was the confirming kind that produces confidence, and the distinction is important because the confidence it produced in Elizabeth was of a specific and durable variety. She knew she was good at the things that mattered in her world. She knew it early, and she knew it without the anxiety that uncertainty about one's gifts tends to produce. The knowledge was settled and quiet, and it expressed itself as ease rather than arrogance, which made it considerably more effective as a social instrument than arrogance would have been. The second thing the Glamis world taught her was the specific relationship between appearance and reality that old aristocratic families in Scotland maintained as a matter of institutional habit. The castle was draughty and expensive to run, and the Strathmore finances were not always as comfortable as the Strathmore position suggested. The gap between what the family represented and what it actually had was not enormous, but it was present, and managing it required the same skill that managing any gap between image and reality requires, a constant, unobtrusive maintenance of the surface that prevented the gap from becoming visible to the people whose perception of the surface mattered. Elizabeth learned, in other words, to manage information, to present what served and withhold what didn't, to understand the difference between what was true and what was useful, and to navigate that difference with the specific social fluency of someone who had been practicing since childhood. The third thing her world taught her was patience. The Scottish aristocratic world she grew up in operated on timescales that the faster worlds she would subsequently inhabit did not. Estates were managed across generations, feuds were maintained across generations, loyalties were maintained across generations. The relevant unit of time for the things that actually mattered was not the week or the year but the decade, and the specific capacity for long-term strategic thinking that this produces. The ability to pursue an objective across years without losing sight of it or becoming impatient with the pace of its achievement was one Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon developed before she was an adult and maintained until she was 101. These three qualities, settled social confidence, skill at managing information and perception, and strategic patience of an unusual order, were the foundation of everything that followed. They were not qualities that the royal family gave her. They were qualities she brought to the royal family from a world that had been producing them in its daughters for centuries, and the royal family never fully reckoned with what it was receiving when it received them. the fourth child of the family to survive into adulthood, and the one whose relationship with Elizabeth would shape her most fundamentally before the palace years, was her brother David, 14 months her senior and the companion of her childhood, in the specific way that siblings close in age and temperament become companions. David Bowes-Lyon was in many ways his sister's male counterpart, charming, socially gifted, possessed of the easy warmth that their world valued and their mother had modelled. The two of them formed a unit within the larger family that was recognizable to people who knew them as a partnership of temperament rather than simply a sibling relationship. What the closeness with David gave Elizabeth, practically, was a model for the specific management of male relationships that would define her adult social world. She understood, through years of close observation of a bright, ambitious man, navigating a world that gave bright, ambitious men the formal authority that bright, ambitious women were required to exercise informally, how to be the intelligence behind the visible position without occupying the visible position herself. She understood how to make a man feel capable and authoritative while being the person who was actually shaping the decisions. She understood the specific social alchemy of powerful women in patriarchal systems, which is the transformation of genuine capability into apparent support. She would practice this alchemy throughout her adult life with a consistency and a refinement that makes it, in retrospect, one of the most impressive sustained performances in 20th century British public life. The childhood at Glamis was interrupted, as childhoods of that generation were interrupted by the First World War. Glamis Castle was converted into a convalescent home for wounded soldiers in 1914, and the specific experience of that conversion, of the ancient family house becoming a place of suffering and recovery, of the young Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, moving through wads of broken men with the combination of warmth and composure that the situation required, is documented in enough contemporary accounts to be regarded as genuinely formative rather than retrospectively embellished. She was 14 when the war started. She was 18 when it ended. Those are the years in which character consolidates from the raw material of childhood into something more fixed, and the raw material in her case was being worked by the specific pressures of wartime, the deaths of people she knew, including her brother Fergus, who was killed at the Battle of Loos in 1915, the constant presence of wounded men at Glamis, the management of grief alongside the management of daily life, in ways that required the specific emotional discipline of someone who cannot afford to be overwhelmed by what they are surrounded by. She learned to hold suffering at a distance without appearing cold. She learned to be present with other people's pain without being consumed by it. She learned the specific skill of warmth under pressure, of projecting ease and calm in circumstances that were neither easy nor calm, that would become one of the most remarked upon qualities of her public life. The years between the end of the war and her marriage to Prince Albert in 1923 were years in which the London social world she moved through was the world of the aristocratic marriage market in its post-war form, changed by the war in ways that everyone felt and nobody could entirely articulate, looser in some of its old rigidities, quicker in its pace, more aware of mortality in the specific way that a generation that had watched its men die in industrial quantities is always more aware of mortality than the generation before it. She was not immediately seized upon by the royal family. The story that gets told of Albert pursuing her persistently through several years and 2 refusals before she accepted is documented well enough to be largely accurate, and the question of why she initially refused is one worth sitting with, because the answer reveals something about how she thought about her own position and what she was assessing when she assessed the prospect of royal marriage. She was not refusing because she was uninterested in Albert. She appears to have been genuinely fond of him, with the specific tenderness that people who are socially confident tend to extend to people who are socially uncertain, and who need their ease to function in the world. Albert was uncertain, the stammer, the anxiety, the secondary position as the second son of a king who was not demonstrably warm toward his children, and Elizabeth's ease with him was real. What she was assessing across the years of the courtship was the institution rather than the man. She had grown up close enough to the royal world to understand what entering it would cost, And the calculation she was making during the years she kept Albert waiting was a calculation about whether the cost was one she was willing to pay, and whether the specific position on offer was one that gave her enough room to be who she actually was, rather than the diminished version of herself that the institution might require. When she accepted, in January 1923, she had completed the calculation and found it satisfactory. Not because the institution was going to give her what she needed, she understood clearly enough that it was not, but because she had assessed her own capacity to take what the institution offered and make it into something that served her purposes as well as its own. She was 22 years old, and she had just made the most consequential decision of her life, with the specific clarity of someone who has been preparing for a decision of that magnitude since childhood. She was not swept away. She was not naive. She was not dazzled by the prospect of becoming royal. She was ready. The institution, as it would discover in the decades that followed, was considerably less ready for her than she was for it. The marriage to Albert, who would become King George VI in circumstances neither of them had planned for or wanted, was the beginning of the public story. But the qualities that would define that public story, that would make her the most effective and the most quietly formidable figure in the 20th century British monarchy, were already fully formed when she walked into it. They had been formed at Glamis, in the specific school of the Scottish aristocracy's particular combination of warmth and steel, in a childhood that had given her confidence and patience, and the ability to manage the gap between appearance and reality, with a fluency that the palace would spend decades failing to recognize as the specific skill it was. She arrived in the royal family as the ideal daughter-in-law, the warm and charming addition to an institution that badly needed warmth and charm. She arrived with her gifts fully developed, and her purposes fully formed, and her patience fully intact. She arrived ready to begin. The institution thought it was welcoming a bride. It was welcoming a strategist. The difference would take years to become visible, by which point it was far too late for the difference to matter. She was already inside the walls. She was already at work. The 6 campaigns were already, in their earliest forms, beginning to take shape. The story of Wallis Simpson and the abdication of Edward Defy in December 1936 has been told so many times and in so many forms that its essential elements have acquired the specific quality of myth. The romantic version, in which a king gave up his throne for the woman he loved, and the institutional version, in which a constitutionally impossible marriage was managed through the mechanism of abdication, with the minimum damage to the monarchy's stability. Both versions exist. Both contain truth. Neither of them tells the story from the angle that matters most for understanding what the abdication produced in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and what she did with what it produced across the subsequent 6.5 decades of her life. The angle that matters is personal, not romantic personal, not constitutional personal, but the specific personal register of a woman who had built everything she had built on the foundation of a particular understanding of what the monarchy was and what it required and what it deserved from the people who served it, and who encountered in Wallis Simpson a direct challenge to every element of that understanding. The challenge was not simply institutional, it was existential, and the response it produced was not simply political management of a constitutional crisis. It was a war, conducted with the specific weapons that Elizabeth had been developing since childhood, prosecuted with the specific patience that Glamis had produced in her, aimed at a specific target with a specific outcome in mind. The outcome was the permanent destruction of Wallis Simpson's position in British public life, and the achievement of that outcome across 65 years of consistent, quiet, devastating campaign is one of the most remarkable exercises of sustained personal power in the history of the modern British monarchy. Wallace Warfield had been born in Pennsylvania in 1896, had married twice before Edward, had the specific kind of American directness and social confidence that the British establishment found simultaneously attractive and threatening, and had developed a relationship with the Prince of Wales that was, by the mid-1930s, the worst-kept secret in the circles that mattered, while remaining largely unknown to the British public, whose press operated under the kind of self-imposed restraint about royal matters that the American press felt no obligation to maintain. Elizabeth's assessment of Wallis was formed early and never revised. It was not primarily a moral assessment, though the moral dimension was present. It was a strategic one. Wallis Simpson was a threat to the institution that Elizabeth had married into and had committed herself to sustaining, and the threat was of a specific kind that the institution's normal defensive mechanisms were not designed to handle. The normal mechanisms were social. The aristocratic world's toolkit of exclusion and condescension, the deployment of the right accent and the right connections and the right history, to mark an outsider as permanently outside, regardless of what proximity to power she had achieved. Those mechanisms worked reliably against most outsiders because most outsiders understood the code well enough to feel their exclusion. Wallis did not feel it or felt it, and was indifferent to it, which amounted to the same thing strategically. She had her own social confidence, built on different foundations from the English aristocratic kind, but no less real for that, and the English establishment's attempts to use the normal, exclusionary toolkit against her produced friction rather than the capitulation that toolkit was designed to generate. Elizabeth understood this about Wallis earlier than most people in her world did, and the understanding shaped her approach to the Simpson problem in ways that went beyond the standard establishment response. She did not attempt to outcharm Wallis. She did not attempt the direct social campaign that would have required open engagement with someone she had already categorized as not worth engaging with directly. She operated instead through the specific mechanisms she had been developing since Glamis: the management of information, the cultivation of the people whose opinions shape the institutional response, the patient maintenance of a position that was clear enough to be useful and quiet enough to be deniable. Her position, maintained with remarkable consistency throughout the abdication crisis and in the decades that followed, was simple. Wallis Simpson was not a suitable consort for the King of England. Her presence in the royal family's world was an affront to the institution and to the women who had given their lives to serving it properly, and the appropriate response to her existence was not confrontation, but the specific, sustained withholding of the recognition that she craved, and that the institution had the power to provide or deny. The withholding was the weapon. Elizabeth wielded it for the rest of her life. The abdication itself, which happened on December 10, 1936, when Edward signed the instrument of abdication and delivered his famous broadcast, and drove to Portsmouth to leave England for what turned out to be the rest of his active life, transformed Elizabeth's position in ways that she understood immediately and that the people around her were slower to process. Her husband, who had been the Duke of York and had expected to remain the Duke of York for the rest of his life, was now the king. She was the Queen. The institution that she had committed herself to at 22 was now hers to protect and sustain in the most direct possible sense. The transformation brought with it a grievance that Elizabeth maintained alongside the institutional responsibility, and the grievance was real in its way, even if its expression was never direct. Albert had not wanted to be king. The stammer, the anxiety, the specific psychological formation of a second son who had organized his entire identity around not being the one who carried the primary burden. All of that was now required to reorganize itself around the primary burden, in conditions of considerable national anxiety about whether the new king could handle what the old king had abandoned. Elizabeth never forgave Wallis for that. The abdication had not simply changed the constitutional position. It had taken her husband, a man she was genuinely fond of and genuinely protective toward, and placed him in conditions that his formation had not prepared him for, and that shortened his life. George VI died in 1952 at the age of 56, his health destroyed by the stresses of the wartime kingship and the years that followed. Elizabeth attributed a significant part of that destruction to the burden that the abdication had placed on him, and she attributed the abdication to Wallis, and she did not forgive. The non-forgiveness was not expressed in the ways that non-forgiveness is usually expressed. There were no public denunciations, no dramatic gestures of exclusion that could be reported and examined. There was instead the consistent deployment of the institution's power to deny recognition and the consistent cultivation of a narrative about Wallis that the press and the public absorbed as simply the natural assessment of an inappropriate person rather than as the product of a sustained campaign. The HRH question is the clearest example of how the campaign operated in practice. When Edward abdicated, he was created Duke of Windsor and left England with Wallis, whom he married in France in June 1937. The question of whether Wallis would receive the title of Her Royal Highness was a legal and constitutional question that the government's lawyers addressed through a formal instrument that denied her the HRH while granting it to the Duke himself. Elizabeth's role in producing that outcome is not documented in any formal sense. There is no memorandum, no recorded conversation, no paper trail that establishes her as the architect of the HRH denial. What there is a consistent pattern of accounts from people close to the relevant decisions that points in one direction, and the consistency of that pattern across independent sources is sufficient to support a conclusion with reasonable confidence. She wanted Wallis denied the HRH. She communicated that want to the people whose decisions would determine the outcome. The outcome was the one she wanted. The absence of a paper trail is not evidence of her non-involvement. It is evidence of her method, which was never to leave paper trails for things she needed to remain deniable. The HRH denial was not simply a social slight. It was a structural exclusion that had practical consequences for every subsequent context in which Wallis appeared in official or semi-official settings. It meant that when the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were received anywhere in the British official world, the protocols that governed how they were treated placed Wallis in a position of formal inferiority that she could not overcome regardless of what her actual relationship to power was. She was the wife of a former king. She was not, by the formal determination of the British state, entitled to the recognition that position should have carried. That formal determination held for the rest of Wallis's life. Elizabeth ensured that it held. The specific mechanism was the sustained communication to the people who managed royal protocol that any relaxation of the determination was unacceptable to the Queen Mother, and the specific effectiveness of that communication was the product of what everyone in the relevant world understood about Elizabeth's position, that she was the Queen's mother, that her views carried weight with the Queen, and that disregarding those views was not something that people in the palace world did without consequences. The Windsors' attempts to secure a return to Britain, to have Wallis recognised with the HRH, to find some official accommodation with the family and the institution they had left, were all unsuccessful in ways that reflect the consistent operation of Elizabeth's resistance. The Duke lobbied for recognition across 35 years of exile. He met the Queen. He corresponded with palace officials. He made his case through every available channel. The case was never granted. The most visible episode of the campaign was the question of whether Wallis would be received at court after the Duke's death in 1972. Edward died at their home in Paris in May of that year, and the Queen invited Wallis to stay at Buckingham Palace during the period of the funeral. The invitation was the Queen's, a gesture of human decency toward a woman who had just lost her husband and who was, by all accounts, in serious physical and cognitive decline. Elizabeth's response to the invitation was managed rather than publicly opposed. She did not instruct the Queen to rescind it. She was not in a position to instruct the Queen to do anything, and the management of her influence over the Queen was always through cultivation rather than command. But the atmosphere surrounding Wallis's brief stay at Buckingham Palace in the days around Edward's funeral was, by the accounts of people who observed it, one of pointed exclusion maintained through the specific mechanisms of the court world. The room she was placed in, the people she was or wasn't introduced to, the degree to which the household organised itself around her comfort or failed to. Elizabeth was present at Balmoral when Wallis died in April 1986. She did not attend the funeral. She sent no public message of condolence. The non-attendance and the silence were not accidental omissions. They were the final statement of a campaign that had been running for 50 years, delivered with the same quiet precision that had characterized every previous move in that campaign. Wallis Simpson died without the HRH. She died without the rehabilitation she had sought. She died without the recognition of the British establishment, whose hostility had defined the conditions of her life from the moment Edward signed the abdication instrument. The campaign had achieved its objective completely. The woman who had prosecuted it was 85 years old and still at Balmoral, still fishing, still drinking her gin, still smiling the smile that concealed everything. She had won. She had always been going to win. She had known that from the beginning, which was why she had never needed to hurry, never needed to raise her voice, never needed to do anything that could be seen and named and challenged. The patience was the weapon. The smile was the cover. The outcome was the one she had always intended. The standard account of the Queen Mother's relationship with the Duke of Windsor positions it as collateral damage from the Wallis campaign. That, her hostility to Edward was primarily an extension of her hostility to his wife, that the Duke himself was a secondary target in a war whose primary objective was the woman he had married. That account is wrong, and it is wrong in ways that matter for understanding both the Queen Mother and the specific nature of the Duke of Windsor's post-abdication existence. Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David, known within the family as David, was a separate target from Wallis Simpson. The grievances Elizabeth held against him were specific and personal and predated Wallis in some of their dimensions, and the campaign she prosecuted against his rehabilitation and his return was driven by assessments of his character and his conduct that had nothing to do with who he had married and everything to do with what she believed he was. What she believed he was, in the plainest possible terms, was a coward and a traitor, not in the legal sense of either word, but in the moral sense that mattered more to Elizabeth than legal definitions. A man who had abandoned a duty he had been born to, who had placed his own desires above the obligation, that his birth and his formation and his entire life's preparation had existed to serve, and who had done it in conditions of national anxiety and international threat that made the abandonment something worse than personal failure. The timing of the abdication was the element that Elizabeth never forgave in the Duke that she could, at a stretch, have forgiven in the abstract. Edward abdicated in December 1936. Europe was already moving toward the war that would arrive 3 years later. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland in March of that year. The political situation on the continent was deteriorating with a speed and a clarity that anyone paying attention could not have missed. The monarchy's stability was not a domestic luxury in those conditions. It was a national strategic asset in a world that was moving toward a conflict in which British morale and British unity would be tested in ways that no living person had experienced. He walked away from that. He walked away from it for a woman, which was bad enough in Elizabeth's framework. He walked away from it at that specific moment, which was unforgivable. The distinction between forgivable and unforgivable in Elizabeth's moral calculus was not arbitrary. It was built on the specific understanding of duty that her formation had given her, and that her marriage had deepened into something close to a religion. Duty was not simply an obligation in her framework. It was the organizing principle of a life that had meaning because of the purposes it served rather than the pleasures it pursued. A man who abandoned duty was not simply a man who had made a bad personal decision. He was a man who had revealed something fundamental about his character that no subsequent behavior could redeem. Edward had revealed it. Elizabeth had seen it, and the seeing had produced a judgment that was final in the way that only judgments formed from genuine conviction rather than personal pique can be final. The personal dimension was real alongside the principled one, and the personal dimension is worth examining with the honesty that accounts of Elizabeth tend to avoid when they approach the question of her relationship with Edward. She had known Edward before she married Albert. The social world of the aristocracy and the royal family in the early 1920s was not large, and Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had been in rooms with the Prince of Wales before she was the Duchess of York. The accounts of people who observed their interactions in that early period suggest a relationship of social warmth without particular depth. They were charming to each other in the way that charming people in overlapping social worlds are charming to each other, without that charm constituting anything more substantial than the surface it appeared on. There is a specific detail in the Queen Mother's story that some biographers have noted and then moved quickly past, perhaps because its implications are uncomfortable, and that is the suggestion that Elizabeth had been considered as a possible match for Edward before her connection to Albert developed. The evidence for this is indirect, and the suggestion has never been substantiated from primary sources. What is established is that Albert was not first of the royal brothers to find Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's qualities remarkable, and that the specific social world of the early 1920s enough crossover between Elizabeth's circle and the Prince of Wales's to make the overlap meaningful. Whether or not there was ever any serious romantic dimension to the relationship between Elizabeth and Edward is not the central point. The central point is that she knew him well enough, from early enough, to have formed a view of his character that predated both his relationship with Wallis and the abdication, and that the view she had formed was not a positive one. She found him unreliable, not in the dramatic sense that the abdication subsequently confirmed, but in the subtler, more domestic sense that manifests in small inconsistencies and small self-indulgences that observers with good social antennae identify as indicators of larger failures to come. She had watched him in social contexts and had seen a man who was charming on the surface and absent in any more meaningful sense, who performed the warmth that his position required without generating the substance that genuine warmth consists of, and who was organized primarily around his own pleasure in ways that the obligations of his position were increasingly failing to override. The abdication confirmed the assessment rather than creating it, and confirmation of a deeply held negative assessment is a powerful intensifier of the feelings that assessment produced. It generates not just the reaction to the specific event, but the vindicated anger of someone who saw something coming and was not listened to. She had seen it coming, she had not been listened to. And then it had happened, and her husband had been required to pick up the burden that Edward had dropped, and the picking up had cost Albert his health and eventually his life. The combination of vindicated assessment, genuine grief for what the abdication had done to Albert, and the principled conviction that Edward had committed a moral failure of the highest order produced in Elizabeth a settled, cold, comprehensive hostility toward the Duke of Windsor that was qualitatively different from the hostility she directed at Wallis. The Wallis hostility was strategic, the Edward hostility was moral, and moral hostility, in Elizabeth's case, was the more dangerous kind, because it had a foundation that strategy could not fully account for and a consistency that strategic considerations could not interrupt. The specific mechanisms through which the campaign against Edward's rehabilitation operated overlapped significantly with the mechanisms of the Wallis campaign, but had additional dimensions that the Wallis campaign did not require. The first additional dimension was the management of the historical narrative. Edward had been king. His reign, brief as it was part of the public record. The question of how that reign was to be remembered, whether as the romantic tragedy of a man who sacrificed a crown for love, or as the dereliction of a man who abandoned his duty at the worst possible moment, was a question with genuine stakes, and Elizabeth understood those stakes and worked consistently to shape the answer in the direction she preferred. The romantic version of the abdication story served Edward's legacy and Wallis's. It made them the central characters in a love story rather than the architects of a constitutional crisis. It generated the sympathy that sustained their social position in the international world they inhabited after leaving England, and it provided the framework within which requests for rehabilitation and recognition could be presented as simply the human decency owed to a man who had paid a great price for a great love. Elizabeth could not prevent the romantic version from existing. It was too useful to too many people, including the press and the public, who found it irresistible in the way that all impossible love stories are irresistible. What she could do was ensure that the alternative version, the duty version, the failure version, the version in which Edward was not a romantic hero, but a man who had let down his country at a critical moment, remained present and credible in the circles where the actual decisions about rehabilitation and recognition were made. She did this through the cultivation of the specific people whose assessments shaped those decisions, the courtiers, the advisors, the household officials who managed the relationship between the Duke of Windsor and the palace across the 35 years of the Duke's life after the abdication. These were people who operated in Elizabeth's social world, who attended her lunches and her dinners and her informal gatherings at Royal Lodge and Clarence House, and who received, through the specific mechanism of her social influence, a consistent signal about how the Duke of Windsor was to be understood. The signal was never explicit. She did not make speeches about Edward's failings at her dinner table. She did not issue memoranda to palace officials about the appropriate handling of Windsor requests. She operated through implication and atmosphere and the specific social currency of her position, which was the most valuable social currency in the relevant world, and which she spent consistently and deliberately in the direction of the outcome she wanted. The outcome she wanted was an Edward who remained in exile in everything that mattered. Not physically, he was allowed to visit. He came back for his mother's funeral and his brother's funeral, and for other occasions where preventing his presence would have generated more institutional damage than allowing it, but institutionally. An Edward who was received but not rehabilitated, allowed but not welcomed, present but not restored. The physical visits are worth examining in some detail because they illustrate the specific texture of Elizabeth's method in relation to Edward with a clarity that the broader campaign sometimes obscures. When Edward returned to London for his mother Queen Mary's funeral in March 1953, the encounter between him and Elizabeth was observed by several people in positions to record it, and the accounts that survive describe an atmosphere of controlled formality that communicated, to anyone fluent in the social codes Elizabeth operated in, exactly the message she intended. She was civil, she was not warm. The distinction between those two things in her social world was the distinction between acknowledgement and acceptance, and she maintained it with a precision that was invisible to outside observers and completely legible to everyone outside the relevant world. Edward received the message. He had been receiving versions of it for 17 years by the time of Queen Mary's funeral, and he had not missed a single transmission. His own accounts of his relationship with Elizabeth during the post-abdication period, expressed in letters and in conversations that were subsequently recorded by the people he shared them with, reflect a man who understood exactly what was being communicated to him and who found the consistency of it across so many years something between impressive and crushing. He was not stupid. He knew she was behind the consistent failure of his rehabilitation efforts. He knew her influence with the Queen was the primary mechanism through which those efforts were blocked. He could not say so publicly without making accusations. He could not substantiate and generating a response from the palace that would have made his position worse. He was, in the most practical sense, trapped, held in place by the specific combination of the institution's power and one woman's sustained exercise of her influence within it. He died in Paris in May 1972, 36 years after the abdication, without the rehabilitation he had sought and without the formal recognition from the family and the institution that might have given his long exile some retrospective dignity. The campaign against him had succeeded as completely as the campaign against Wallis. He died without the thing he most wanted, which was to be allowed to come home in the full sense of that word, to be received by the institution he had left as someone who, whatever mistakes he had made, was still one of them. He was not allowed to be one of them. He had forfeited that. In Elizabeth's judgment, on December 10, 1936, and no subsequent conduct, no appeal, no passage of time had been sufficient to reverse the forfeiture. The judgment was hers, the enforcement of it was hers, the outcome was hers. She outlived him by 30 years. She was 101 years old when she died, and in those 30 years she had outlived not only Edward, but the possibility of any rehabilitation of his legacy that her influence could reach. The man who had been king for 326 days in 1936 spent the next 6.5 decades as the permanent subject of the most sustained exercise of personal institutional power that the 20th century British monarchy produced. The power was Elizabeth's. The exercise of it was constant. The result was as final as results get. He did not come home. He was not allowed to come home. She had made sure of it. Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma, was by almost any measure the most formidable figure the British royal family's extended world in the second half of the 20th century. He was a war hero in the genuine sense. His naval career was distinguished. His role as Supreme Allied Commander Southeast Asia during the Second World War was historically significant. His management of Indian independence as the last viceroy was one of the most consequential political acts of the post-war era. He was charming and brilliant and vain in the specific way that genuinely exceptional people, who have always known they are exceptional, tend to be vain. He was connected to every significant royal family in Europe through the web of relationships that the Victorian era's dynastic marriages had produced. He was, in the specific world that Elizabeth inhabited, exactly the kind of man who presents the specific kind of threat that powerful women in patriarchal systems most need to manage. He was the kind of man who believed he was the most important person in any room he entered, and who was right often enough that the belief had hardened into a reflex rather than an assessment. Elizabeth was also, in her specific and less visible way, the most important person in every room she entered. The collision between those two orientations was not loud or dramatic, or conducted in the open spaces of public life where it could be observed and reported. It was quiet and sustained and conducted through the invisible mechanisms of institutional influence that both of them understood and that only one of them was willing to use without restraint. She was willing, he was not in the end quite willing enough, and the difference in their willingness is the central explanation for why the campaign Elizabeth ran against Mountbatten's influence succeeded in the ways that mattered most. The origins of the tension between Elizabeth and Mountbatten are located in the immediate post-war period, specifically in the question of what the royal family was going to be called. The question sounds trivial in the retelling, and was anything but trivial in the context of 1952 and 1953, when the Queen acceded to the throne and the question of the royal house's name became suddenly and practically urgent. The issue was Philip. Philip Mountbatten had married Princess Elizabeth in 1947 as a naturalised British subject who had renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, taken a British surname, Mountbatten, which was the anglicised version of his mother's family name Battenberg. The standard practice in British dynastic history was that a queen regnant's children took the surname of their father, which would have meant that Elizabeth II's children and the royal house, going forward, would be named Mountbatten rather than Windsor. Louis Mountbatten understood this. He understood it with a clarity and an enthusiasm that he expressed, with the specific lack of discretion that his vanity occasionally produced, in terms that were not carefully enough managed to prevent them from reaching the people they most needed not to reach. He was reported, by several sources, to have remarked with satisfaction that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in England. The remark, whether precisely accurate in its quoted form or slightly embellished in the transmission, captured something real about his orientation. That the question of the royal family's name was for him a dynastic question with a dynastic answer, and that the dynastic answer was one that served his family's legacy and his own. Elizabeth heard the remark, or heard the reports of it. Her response was the response that her method always produced in situations where a direct confrontation was available but inadvisable. She did not challenge Mountbatten directly. She did not raise the matter in formal contexts where it would require a formal resolution. She went instead to the Queen. The Queen, in the earliest years of the reign, was a young woman of 25, navigating the enormous demands of a role she had not expected to occupy for another generation, and that had arrived suddenly with the death of her father in February 1952. She was managing the machinery of monarchy while managing her grief, and while managing a domestic life that the demands of the role were already placing under strains that would become more visible as the years went on. She was not, in those early years, a woman who had fully consolidated the specific authority that the long reign would eventually give her. Her mother was the person she trusted most completely. The relationship between Elizabeth and the Queen in those years was not simply maternal, in the ordinary sense. It was a relationship of political and institutional confidence that the Queen extended to her mother, because her mother had been inside the institution longer, understood it more completely, and had demonstrated across the previous decade a capacity for managing its pressures and its conflicts that the Queen's own experience had not yet produced. When Elizabeth communicated to the Queen that the Mountbatten name question required resolution, and communicated it in the way she communicated things that mattered to her, which was with a warmth and a reasonableness that made the communication feel like advice rather than direction. The Queen listened with the specific quality of attention she extended to her mother's counsel. The outcome was a royal proclamation in April 1952, issued within weeks of the accession, declaring that the royal house and family would continue to be styled and known as the House and Family of Windsor. Philip's name was not going to name the dynasty. Mountbatten's legacy was not going to be attached to the throne. Mountbatten's response to the proclamation was not publicly expressed in terms that created an open confrontation. He was too politically sophisticated to make that mistake. But the people close to him documented a private response that reflected genuine bitterness. He felt the outcome was unjust. He felt it had been engineered against him, and he was correct on both counts. He was correct that it had been engineered. He was not entirely correct about who had engineered it, or rather he underestimated the completeness of Elizabeth's role in the outcome and attributed too much of it to Churchill, who had also opposed the Mountbatten name, and not enough to the sustained cultivation of the Queen's instinct on the question that Elizabeth had been conducting since the accession. Churchill's opposition was real and consequential, but Churchill was the Prime Minister whose involvement in a question of royal nomenclature was constitutionally appropriate and institutionally expected. Elizabeth's involvement was neither constitutionally expected nor institutionally visible, which made it considerably more difficult to challenge or to document. She had shaped the outcome through the channel that no external political actor could reach, and she had done it before the question was formally in play, in ways that made her influence look like the Queen's own settled view rather than counsel received and adopted. The name question was the opening engagement of a campaign that would run for the next quarter century. The subsequent engagements were organized around the same central objective: the reduction of Mountbatten's influence over the royal family, and specifically over Philip and through Philip over the Queen, and they were conducted with the same combination of patience and indirection that had characterized the opening. Philip was the key variable. Mountbatten's influence over Philip was real, deep, and long established. He had been the dominant paternal figure of Philip's adult life, in ways that Philip's actual father, the largely absent Prince Andrew of Greece, had not been. He had guided Philip's naval career. He had shaped Philip's political education. He had been the architect of Philip's introduction to the royal family and the primary advocate for the match with Elizabeth. The relationship between uncle and nephew was the closest thing to a father-son relationship that either of them had, and its emotional reality was not something Elizabeth could simply dismantle. What she could do was manage it, not break it, which would have been both impossible and counterproductive. Philip's loyalty to Mountbatten was too deep to be severed by external pressure, and attempting to sever it would have produced a confrontation with Philip that served nobody's interests. What she could do was ensure that the specific forms of Mountbatten's influence that threatened the institutional outcome she needed were contained, and that the containment was achieved through the cultivation of Philip's own instincts rather than through direct challenge. Philip was not a simple man, and he was not without political intelligence of his own. He understood the institutional requirements of his position with a clarity that his public image as a blunt, unreflective figure has consistently obscured. He understood that his uncle's ambitions, however genuine the affection behind them, created complications for the institution that could not be indefinitely managed. He understood, in other words, that there were contexts in which Mountbatten needed to be kept at a distance, and that the requirement for distance was not simply Elizabeth's preference but an institutional necessity. Elizabeth did not need to tell Philip this directly. She cultivated the understanding through years of conversation and observation and the specific management of her own relationship with Philip, which was warmer and more comfortable than the standard account of the Queen Mother and her son-in-law suggests. She understood Philip better than most people gave her credit for, and the understanding was the instrument she used to maintain her influence over the relevant decisions without appearing to exercise it. Mountbatten's political ambitions were the dimension of his character that Elizabeth found most concerning and that she worked most consistently to contain. His role in Indian independence had given him a taste of the largest possible political stage, and the taste had not been satisfied by the subsequent decades of ceremonial and institutional function that his official roles provided. He had views about how the monarchy should develop, about the direction of British foreign policy, about the management of the Commonwealth, and he expressed those views with an energy and a persistence that reflected his genuine belief that his experience and his intelligence entitled him to be heard on the largest questions. Elizabeth did not dispute the experience or the intelligence. She disputed the entitlement in the specific sense that she believed Mountbatten's orientation was always coloured by his own dynastic interests in ways that made his advice unreliable as disinterested counsel. A man who had wanted his family name on the throne was not a man whose institutional advice could be taken at face value in contexts where his family's legacy was implicated. That assessment, communicated through the channels she used for all her significant communications, shaped the way Mountbatten's views were received in the palace world across the relevant decades. He remained a significant figure. He retained his access to Philip and through Philip to the broader royal world. But the specific weight given to his counsel on institutional questions was consistently less than he believed it deserved, and the deficit reflected the accumulated effect of Elizabeth's consistent signal about the reliability of that counsel. The assassination of Mountbatten by the IRA on August 27, 1979, which killed him along with his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull, and a 15-year-old crew member named Paul Maxwell, ended the campaign in the specific sense that it ended the subject of it. The bomb was placed on his fishing boat Shadow V in the harbour at Mullaghmore in County Sligo, Ireland, and detonated remotely as the boat left the harbour on a fine summer morning. The manner of his death was horrifying, and the grief it produced in the people who loved him was genuine, and the public mourning it generated was real. Elizabeth's public response was composed and appropriate, and communicated the grief of a woman who had known Mountbatten for 60 years and who understood the significance of the loss in personal as well as institutional terms. Whether she felt the private grief that the public response suggested is a question that nobody in a position to know has answered directly. What is established is that in the years following his death, the specific institutional concerns that had organised her campaign against his influence gradually resolved themselves in the direction she had always intended, without the complications that his continued presence would have created. The name of the royal house remained Windsor. The dynastic legacy he had wanted remained unachieved in the form he had wanted it. His influence over Philip had been real and remained real in memory. But memory does not make institutional decisions in the way that living presence does. She had been patient for 27 years. The patience had been sufficient. The campaign had not required its conclusion to achieve its objectives, because the objectives had been achieved through the sustained management of institutional outcomes across the years of its prosecution. By the time the bomb in the harbour at Mullaghmore ended the story had already been resolved in the ways that mattered. He had not gotten what he wanted. She had gotten what she needed. The distinction was the measure of who had actually held the relevant power across the relevant decades. It had never been him. The Peter Townsend affair is one of the most extensively documented episodes in the post-war history of the British royal family, and it has been told primarily as a love story. The princess and the equerry, the impossible romance, the institutional forces that prevented two people who loved each other from building a life together. The telling has been shaped, over the decades, by sympathy for Margaret and by the specific cultural appetite for stories about love defeated by circumstance that makes the romantic version irresistible to audiences and useful to storytellers. The romantic version is not false. The love was real. The defeat was real. The specific suffering that the defeat produced in Margaret, which ran through the rest of her life like a fault line, and contributed to the specific forms that her unhappiness took across the subsequent 50 years, was real and documented, and not in serious dispute. What the romantic version consistently obscures is the agency of the woman who was most centrally positioned to determine the outcome, and who has, in the standard account, been given a role that makes her either a passive bystander or a sympathetic figure caught between maternal love and institutional duty. That woman was Elizabeth. The Queen Mother's role in the Townsend affair has been examined in fragments across multiple accounts of the period, with different biographers finding different evidence and drawing different conclusions about the degree to which her influence shaped the outcome. The fragment-based examination has never produced a fully assembled picture, partly because the relevant documents remain sealed, and partly because the people with direct knowledge of the relevant conversations maintained the discretion that the palace world demanded. What the assembled fragments support, when they are examined as a pattern rather than as individual data points, is a conclusion that goes considerably further than the standard account allows. Elizabeth did not simply fail to help Margaret. She actively shaped the conditions in which the relationship was managed in ways that made a positive outcome progressively less achievable, and she did so from a position of influence over the Queen that was the most powerful single variable in the institutional response to the affair. Peter Townsend was a decorated RAF pilot who had served as an equerry to George VI from 1944 and who had, after the King's death in 1952, been appointed Comptroller of the Queen Mother's household. He was 16 years older than Margaret, divorced from his first wife Rosemary, with 2 sons from that marriage, and in the specific position of a man who had been inside the royal household long enough to be genuinely known to the family rather than simply professionally associated with it. The relationship between him and Margaret developed in the period following George VI's death in the specific emotional conditions of a household in profound grief, in which the normal social distances were temporarily reduced by shared loss. Margaret was 21 when her father died, the younger daughter in a family that had just lost the person who had been its emotional center, navigating a grief that was personal and intimate, while watching her older sister take on the full weight of the institution their father had carried. She fell in love with Townsend with the specific completeness that first serious love produces, particularly in people who have been formed in environments that made emotional intimacy difficult, and who find, in a particular person, the ease and warmth and genuine seeing that the forming environment denied them. Townsend offered Margaret something that the royal world she inhabited was structurally incapable of producing: a man who knew her well enough to see past the performance of royalty to the actual person underneath it, and who valued what he saw. The feeling was reciprocated. The accounts of people who observed them together in the relevant period describe a relationship of genuine warmth and genuine depth, and the consistency of those accounts across independent sources makes the romantic reality of the attachment something that no honest telling of the story can dismiss. Elizabeth's initial response to the relationship was not the overt hostility that subsequent events might have predicted. Her early management of it was the management of a woman who understood that overt hostility would produce exactly the strengthening of the attachment that opposition to young love always produces, and who had the patience and the intelligence to allow the situation to develop through channels that served her purposes better than direct intervention. She was warm to Townsend. She was not cold to Margaret about Townsend. She maintained the atmosphere of the household she headed with the same even, gracious warmth that she maintained in every other context, and the maintenance of that warmth, while simultaneously cultivating the institutional response that would eventually make the relationship impossible, was the most sophisticated move of the entire affair. The institutional response was organized around 2 facts that were legally and constitutionally clear. Townsend was divorced, which under the Church of England's doctrine as it existed in 1953 made him unavailable as a marriage partner for a member of the royal family, without generating a contradiction with the monarch's role as the head of that church. The same contradiction had been the constitutional core of the Wallis Simpson problem, and the parallel was not lost on anyone involved in managing the Townsend situation, least of all Elizabeth. The parallel was not lost on her because she had been the person most directly affected by the Wallis Simpson situation, and because the specific institutional logic that had made Wallis unacceptable was the same logic that made Townsend unacceptable, and because that logic was something Elizabeth had not simply accepted as an external constraint, but had internalized as a genuine moral position. She believed in it. She believed that the monarchy's relationship with the Church of England was not simply a constitutional formality, but a genuine obligation that shaped what the institution could and could not accommodate. She believed that divorced people remarrying introduced a contradiction into the specific identity of an institution that derived part of its legitimacy from its relationship with a church that did not recognize divorce as permissible. She believed this with the genuine conviction of a woman whose religious formation had been real and whose understanding of the monarchy's purpose was organized around exactly these kinds of institutional obligations. The belief was genuine. It was also convenient in the specific sense that genuine beliefs can be convenient. It allowed Elizabeth to pursue an outcome that served institutional interests she held for multiple reasons, while presenting that pursuit as a matter of principle rather than preference. The management of the Townsend affair proceeded through the Queen, and the management of the Queen proceeded through Elizabeth, and the chain of influence was the chain that ran through every significant institutional decision of the early reign in which Elizabeth's interests were engaged. The Queen's position on the Townsend affair was, from the beginning, one of genuine conflict between sisterly love and institutional obligation. She loved Margaret. She understood the reality and the depth of the attachment. She also understood the institutional constraints with a clarity that her role required her to maintain, even when that clarity produced outcomes that cost her sister something real. Elizabeth's influence over the Queen in this context operated in the specific way it always operated, not as direction or command, but as the sustained cultivation of the Queen's instinct toward the institutional outcome. The conversations between Elizabeth and the Queen about Townsend were not recorded and have not been described in direct terms by anyone who was present. What has been described by people close to both women is a pattern of maternal counsel that consistently reinforced the Queen's instinct toward institutional caution and away from the sympathetic exception that Margaret's situation might have warranted. The specific mechanism of the Townsend management that most clearly bears Elizabeth's signature was the decision to send Townsend away from England. In July 1953, 2 months after the coronation, Townsend was appointed air attaché at the British Embassy in Brussels and told he would be taking up the posting immediately. The posting removed him from England, separated him from Margaret, and placed him in a context in which the relationship would have to survive the specific attrition of distance and time rather than being sustained by daily proximity. The decision about the posting was presented as an administrative matter, a routine appointment of a qualified RAF officer to a diplomatic posting. It was not a routine appointment. It was a deliberate separation, organized through channels that had the institutional authority to make it without creating the appearance of a punitive action against either party. Elizabeth's role in the decision to post Townsend to Brussels is not documented in the formal records that have been made available. What is documented across multiple independent accounts of the period is that the decision was made at a level of institutional authority that reflected input from the most senior figures in the royal household, and that among those figures, Elizabeth was the one with the clearest interest in the outcome the posting was designed to produce. Townsend spent 2 years in Brussels. When he returned in 1955, the relationship resumed with the specific intensity of an attachment that absence had deepened rather than eroded, and the institutional problem it presented had not been resolved by the separation. It had simply been deferred to a moment when the resolution could be managed under more controlled conditions. The controlled conditions of October 1955 were the conditions of a decision that Margaret was required to make publicly and formally under a timeline created by the Royal Marriages Act about whether she wished to marry Townsend. If she did, she would be required to give up her place in the line of succession, her royal title, and her civil list income. If she did not, the matter would be closed. The framing of the choice as a binary between love and duty, between personal happiness and institutional obligation, was itself the most effective mechanism of the entire management operation, because it made Margaret the author of whatever outcome her decision produced. If she chose Townsend, she bore the consequences of that choice. If she chose duty, she bore the consequences of that choice. The institution, and specifically the people within it, who had shaped the conditions in which the choice was being made, were removed from the moral equation by the framing. The framing was Elizabeth's contribution more than anyone else's. She had not created the Royal Marriages Act or the Church of England's doctrine on divorce, but she had managed the institutional response to the affair in ways that made those pre-existing constraints into the architecture of a decision that Margaret was required to make alone, without the specific support from the most powerful person in her world that might have changed the calculation. Elizabeth did not tell Margaret to give up Townsend. She did not need to. She had managed the conditions in which the decision was made in such a way that the institutional weight was entirely on one side of the scale, and Margaret, who loved her mother and who had been formed in the specific way that royal daughters are formed, was not capable of sustaining the position that would have required her to place her own happiness above what the institution required. Margaret chose duty. She issued a public statement on October 31st, 1955, saying that she had decided not to marry Group Captain Townsend, mindful of the Church and Commonwealth. The statement was received with public sympathy and institutional relief. Elizabeth received the news with the composure that she received everything of significance, which was the composure of a woman for whom the outcome had been the expected one rather than a surprise. The cost of the outcome was paid by Margaret across the next 50 years. The marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones in 1960 was a real attachment in its early years and a painful failure in its later ones. The drinking and the unhappiness and the specific quality of Margaret's adult life, as a woman who felt she had sacrificed the thing that mattered most, were real and documented and visible to everyone in the family who was paying attention. Elizabeth paid the cost. She paid it with the specific currency of maternal knowledge. She knew what Margaret had given up, and she knew what it had cost, and she knew her own role in creating the conditions of the cost. The knowledge was managed in the way that Elizabeth managed everything difficult, through the maintenance of the warm surface that kept the difficult thing from becoming the visible thing. She loved Margaret. The love was genuine and demonstrated across their shared life in ways that real love demonstrates itself. She had also, out of that love, or alongside it or despite it, made the decision that the institution's requirements outweighed her daughter's happiness in the specific calculation of the Townsend affair. The decision was coherent within Elizabeth's framework of values. It was the same decision she had made, implicitly, in every other context where the institution's requirements and an individual's happiness had come into conflict. The institution always won in her framework, not because she was cold, but because she believed, with the genuine conviction that defined everything she did, that the institution was worth more than any individual happiness, including the happiness of her own child. That belief was the engine of everything she built and everything she destroyed. It was the belief that made her formidable. It was the belief that made her, in the specific context of Margaret's life, something that the warmth and the love and the genuine maternal devotion cannot entirely redeem. She had made the daughter choose. The choosing had cost Margaret everything she had wanted. Elizabeth had known it would. She had managed it that way anyway. The management of information about powerful people is one of the oldest institutional activities in human history, and the British royal family has been engaged in it with varying degrees of sophistication for as long as there has been a British royal family to manage. The specific form it took in the 20th century was shaped by the emergence of mass media, newspapers, then radio, then television, that gave the institution both the opportunity to project a carefully constructed image to audiences of unprecedented size and the threat of scrutiny from the same audiences if the construction failed to hold. Elizabeth understood this dynamic with a precision that reflected her formation in a world where the management of appearance was not an adjunct to social life but its primary operating principle. She had grown up in a household where the gap between what the family represented and what it actually had was maintained by constant, unobtrusive management of the surface. She had spent her adult life in an institution whose survival depended on the public's willingness to accept a constructed image as a genuine one. The management of information was not, for her, a political or communication strategy in the modern professional sense. It was a fundamental life practice, as natural and as continuous as breathing. The people who threatened the myth were not a single category. They were journalists and biographers, and courtiers who had served inside the household and left with knowledge that the institution had not authorized them to share. They were former staff members whose proximity to the private reality behind the public image had given them a perspective that the image could not survive if it became public. They were historians and academics whose research was taking them into territories that the palace preferred to keep unmapped. They were, in several cases, people within the family's own world whose relationships with Elizabeth had given them knowledge that her continued management of her own narrative required to remain contained. The methods she used against each category were specific to the category, and the specificity is revealing about the breadth of her operational toolkit and the sophistication with which she deployed it. Against journalists, the primary tool was access management. The British royal family's relationship with the press in the mid-20th century was organized around a system of mutual benefit and mutual constraint that served both parties in ways that each understood. The press received access to to authorized photographs, to the managed disclosures that the palace's press operation provided, in exchange for a degree of restraint about the private realities behind the public image that the palace required. The exchange was not formal, and it was not always honored, but it was real enough to shape the landscape of royal coverage for most of Elizabeth's adult life. Elizabeth's specific contribution to the management of this exchange was the cultivation of individual journalists whose favorable coverage of her was sustained by a relationship of personal warmth and selective access that she maintained with remarkable consistency across decades. She was good company. She was genuinely charming in social settings. She had the specific social skill of making people she spent time with feel that they occupied a special position in her regard, and journalists who experienced that feeling were journalists who had a professional interest in maintaining the access that produced it. The corollary was the withdrawal of access from journalists whose coverage threatened the myth, and the withdrawal was managed with the same precision as the cultivation. It was not dramatic. It was not accompanied by public statements or formal complaints. The access simply stopped being available. The invitations to events stopped arriving. The members of the household who had been useful intermediaries became suddenly less available. The journalists who had been inside the circle found themselves outside it, without any explicit moment of exclusion that they could identify and report. The invisibility of the exclusion was its effectiveness. A journalist who has been cut off from royal access without being able to identify why or how has no story to tell about being cut off and no specific grievance to pursue. They simply no longer have access, and the absence of access gradually removes them from the field of people capable of producing coverage that threatens the myth. The biographers presented a different challenge and required a different response, because the biographical project is longer in its development than journalism and more systematic in its research, and the people who undertook it in relation to Elizabeth were often academics or serious writers, whose professional standing gave them a kind of institutional protection that freelance journalists did not have. The specific case of Michael Bloch's work on the Duke and Duchess of Windsor illustrates the approach Elizabeth took to biographical projects that threatened the narrative she had spent decades constructing. Bloch had access to the Windsor papers and was producing work that drew on primary sources to complicate the standard accounts of the abdication and its aftermath in ways that reflected less favourably on the institutional response to the Windsors than the official narrative allowed. Elizabeth did not attempt to prevent Bloch's work from being published. The attempt would have failed and would have generated the specific kind of attention that attempts at suppression always generate. The story of the suppression becomes the story, and the story of the suppression is always worse for the suppressor than the original material would have been. She understood this with the political intelligence that characterized her approach to every situation where direct action was available, but inadvisable. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What she did instead was cultivate the reception of his work, the way it was reviewed, the way it was discussed in the circles that shaped public understanding of royal history. the degree to which its findings were taken up and amplified in the subsequent literature, the specific mechanisms through which she shaped reception rather than production, are less well documented than the mechanisms through which she shaped access, partly because reception management operates through informal networks that leave fewer traces than formal interventions. What is documented is the pattern of outcomes, the consistent record of biographical work that challenged the official narrative, receiving a reception in the royal adjacent press and academic world that was cooler and more skeptical than the work's own merits might have predicted, while work that reinforced the official narrative received a reception that reflected the specific warmth of a world that had been managed to prefer certain stories over others. The courtiers and former staff who represented the most intimate threat to the myth were the category Elizabeth managed, with the most personal and sustained attention, because their knowledge was the most specific and the most potentially damaging. These were people who had been inside the household. They had seen the private behavior, they had heard the private conversations. They knew the specific texture of the reality behind the image in ways that journalists and biographers, however thorough their research, could not fully access. The management of this category operated primarily through the cultivation of loyalty and the specific social and professional consequences of breaching it. The palace world had always operated on a code of discretion that was reinforced by the social and professional rewards available to those who maintained it and the social and professional consequences available to those who did not. Elizabeth's management of this code was not simply the passive benefit of an existing system. She was active cultivator of its specific application to the people who had served her and who carried knowledge of her private life. She was a generous and personally warm employer in many respects. People who served her well were rewarded with the specific currency of her world, the warmth of her regard, the continuation of a relationship that extended beyond the formal employment, the sense of being genuinely valued that her social skill made it possible to produce in people she needed to keep close. Former staff who maintained discretion remained inside the circle of her warmth and her access and the specific social position that proximity to her conferred. The ones who didn't are the more instructive cases, and those cases are necessarily less well documented because the consequences of breaking the palace world's code of discretion are themselves operated through invisible mechanisms rather than formal ones. A former member of the Queen Mother's household who gave an interview to a newspaper or provided material to a biographer did not receive a formal letter of rebuke. What they received was the sudden cooling of the relationships that had defined their social world since leaving service, the sense of doors closing without anyone saying explicitly that doors were being closed, the specific experience of being quietly removed from the circle without being told why. The quietness of the removal was the point. People who are removed quietly cannot complain loudly. People who cannot identify the specific mechanism of their exclusion cannot challenge it. The system worked because it operated below the threshold of articulable grievance, and it operated below that threshold by design. The most significant instance of Elizabeth's information management in relation to the myth was not about any specific piece of information, but about the oval construction of her public biography and the degree to which she controlled the terms on which her life was recorded and interpreted. She never wrote a memoir. The decision not to write a memoir was a decision, not an oversight. A memoir would have required her to make choices about what to include and what to exclude, and those choices would have created a record that could be compared to other records and interrogated by the people who would subsequently research her life. The absence of a memoir was itself a form of information management. It left all of her biographical interpretation open to be shaped by the people she trusted and the sources she controlled, rather than by a fixed text that could become the basis for challenge. She gave interviews selectively throughout her life, and the selectivity was the management of the interview form rather than simple media shyness. The interviews she gave were given to people and in formats where the terms of engagement were favorable to her, where the questions were likely to be the questions she wanted to answer, and the context was likely to be the context that served the image she was maintaining. She was never exposed to the kind of sustained, adversarial questioning that would have required her to maintain the myth under pressure from someone who had done the research and was prepared to challenge the construction. The management of the myth was the management of her biography across a century of public life, and the success of that management is measurable in the simplest possible way. The image with which she died was essentially the image with which she had entered public life, adjusted for age and for the specific warmth that longevity generates in public figures who survive long enough to become genuinely beloved. The image had survived everything that should have complicated it. The Wallis campaign, the Townsend affair, the financial reality of her debt, which ran to several £1,000,000 by the end of her life, and which was quietly managed through the royal household's financial machinery in ways that never became the public scandal they would have been for anyone else. The specific quality of her private life, the drinking, which was substantial and well documented among people who knew her, the gambling on horses, the specific pleasures of a woman whose appetites were considerable and whose positions had always allowed her to indulge them without public comment. None of it had damaged the image. None of it had produced the kind of public reckoning that the same facts, attached to a less carefully managed public figure, would have produced. The management had worked. It had worked across 8 decades and through every challenge that should have broken it. She died the nation's grandmother. She died beloved. She died with the image intact. The people who had tried to complicate the image had been managed. The information that would have complicated it had been contained. The myth had been maintained with a consistency and a thoroughness that was, in its specific way, as impressive as anything else she had achieved. It was the achievement she would have been most reluctant to acknowledge, and the one that required the most sustained intelligence to produce. She had been producing it since before most of the people trying to challenge it had been born. They had never had a chance. The relationship between Elizabeth and Diana Spencer is one that the standard accounts of both women's lives have consistently failed to examine with the analytical honesty it deserves. Partly because Diana's story has been told primarily through the lens of her own suffering, and partly because the Queen Mother's image has been protected by the same mechanisms that protected it against every other challenge. The two frameworks, Diana as victim, the Queen Mother as beloved grandmother, are mutually reinforcing in the sense that each makes the other easier to maintain. A beloved grandmother cannot be a woman who enabled the conditions of her granddaughter-in-law's suffering. A suffering victim cannot be a woman who was assessed accurately and found wanting by someone who understood the institution better than she did. Both frameworks are wrong in the specific ways that comfortable frameworks about complicated people are always wrong, and the truth that exists beneath them is considerably more interesting and considerably more disturbing than either the official version or the sympathetic one. Elizabeth assessed Diana Spencer with the accuracy of a woman who had spent 60 years studying the relationship between individual personalities and institutional requirements, and who had developed, through that study, a diagnostic capacity for identifying the specific qualities in a person that the institution could accommodate and the specific qualities it could not. The assessment was not warm and it was not unkind in the deliberate sense. It was clear-eyed in the way that Elizabeth's assessments always were, and it was final in the way that her final assessments always were, and the finality of it shaped her relationship to Diana's situation across the 15 years of Diana's marriage and beyond. What Elizabeth saw in Diana from relatively early in the relationship was a woman whose qualities were the wrong kind of qualities for the institution she was entering. Not wrong in the sense of being bad qualities in any ordinary moral sense. Wrong in the specific institutional sense that the monarchy required a specific combination of personal strength and personal effacement that Diana's formation had not produced, and that her personality was not going to develop in the direction the institution needed. Diana was emotionally transparent in ways that the institution could not accommodate. She was a woman whose inner life expressed itself on her surface. The eyes, the body language, the specific quality of her public presentations that communicated suffering with an immediacy and a legibility that the institution's management machinery was not designed to handle. She needed things from the institution. emotional support, genuine inclusion, the sense of being valued as a person rather than simply as a function, that the institution was constitutionally incapable of providing. Elizabeth had needed things from the institution too, at the beginning. She had needed space to be herself rather than simply a royal wife. She had needed the room to develop her own identity within the institutional framework rather than being entirely consumed by it. She had found that room through the specific mechanisms of her own intelligence and patience. She had taken what the institution offered and made something of her own from it that served both her purposes and the institution's. She expected Diana to do the same, not consciously, not as a clearly articulated expectation, but as the instinctive assumption of a woman who had managed the institution's demands through intelligence and will, and who found it difficult to extend sufficient sympathy to someone who was failing to manage them in the same way. The failure of sympathy is the central mechanism of Elizabeth's contribution to Diana's suffering, and it operated through the most powerful channel available to it, her relationship with the Queen. The Queen's handling of Diana across the years of the marriage has been extensively documented and extensively criticised, and the criticism is largely deserved. The institutional coldness, the failure to provide the personal support that Diana needed, the specific management of the marriage public presentation sin in ways that prioritized the institution's image over Diana's welfare. These were the Queen's decisions and the Queen's failures, and they cannot be attributed to Elizabeth in any direct sense. What can be attributed to Elizabeth is the sustained cultivation of the Queen's instinct toward institutional caution and away from the personal intervention that Diana needed in exactly the same way that she had cultivated that instinct in the Townsend affair. The pattern was the same. The mechanism was the same. The outcome served the institution's interests and cost the individual everything. The specific content of Elizabeth's communications to the Queen about Diana is not documented in any accessible form. The conversations between Elizabeth and the Queen about the Wales marriage were private, conducted in the specific register of a mother-daughter relationship that had always been the closest personal relationship of the Queen's life, and the privacy of those conversations has been maintained with the same thoroughness that characterized Elizabeth's management of every other sensitive information context. What is documented across multiple accounts of the period from people who were inside or adjacent to the relevant world is the general atmosphere of Elizabeth's attitude toward Diana, and the specific ways that attitude expressed itself in the social, institutional context of the royal family's internal life. The atmosphere was not hostile in the overt sense. Elizabeth was never publicly unkind to Diana. She was never documented making the direct personal criticisms that some members of the royal family made in contexts that subsequently became public. She maintained the warm surface that she maintained in every context, and the warmth was not entirely performed. She was capable of genuine affection for Diana, in the way that she was capable of genuine affection for people she simultaneously found inadequate to the requirements of their position. The specific form the inadequacy took, in Elizabeth's assessment, was Diana's unwillingness to subordinate her private self entirely to the institutional requirements of her role. Elizabeth had made that subordination the organizing principle of her own life. She had found it not simply acceptable but genuinely meaningful, because her belief in the institution gave the subordination a purpose that made it something other than simple self-erasure. She could not fully understand a woman for whom the subordination was intolerable, because the intolerance reflected a set of values about individual identity and personal happiness that were, in Elizabeth's framework, simply not the relevant considerations. This was not cruelty. It was the specific limitation of a woman whose own resolution of the tension between self and institution had been so complete that she had lost the capacity to fully inhabit the perspective of someone for whom the tension was unresolvable. The Diana problem in Elizabeth's assessment was not primarily a problem of Charles. It was a problem of Diana. A woman who was properly formed for institutional life would have found a way to manage the marriage's difficulties, to maintain the required public performance, to subordinate the private suffering to the institutional necessity. Diana had not found that way, and the failure to find it was, in Elizabeth's framework, a failure of the specific qualities that the role required. The framework was not wrong in its assessment of what the role required. It was wrong in its failure to ask whether the role's requirements were themselves legitimate, whether the institution had any obligation to the human beings it consumed in its service, whether the woman it was assessing had any claim to consideration that the institution's requirements did not override. Elizabeth had never asked those questions about herself. She was not going to ask them about Diana. The specific moments in Diana's story where Elizabeth's influence can be most clearly identified are the moments of institutional decision-making about how the marriage and its difficulties were to be managed publicly. The decision to maintain the public performance of the marriage long after the private reality had collapsed, the decision about the terms of the separation announcement, the management of Diana's access to official platforms after the separation, the specific handling of the HRH question in the divorce. In each of these moments, the institutional calculation that produced the outcome was a calculation made within a framework that Elizabeth had been the primary cultivator of across the Queen's entire reign. She had not made those decisions directly. She had made the Queen who made those decisions in the specific sense that her influence over the Queen's institutional instincts was the deepest and most sustained of any influence in the Queen's life. The Queen's framework for understanding what the monarchy required and what individuals within it were owed was a framework that had been shaped by 60 years of Elizabeth's consistent, warm, patient cultivation. Diana's experience of that framework was the experience of a woman who had entered an institution expecting to be accommodated and discovering, instead, that the institution did not accommodate, it expected to be served. The Panorama interview of November 1995, in which Diana spoke directly to Martin Bashir about the marriage and her experience of the royal family, was received by Elizabeth with the specific response that Elizabeth gave to every significant public challenge to the myth: composed disapproval, communicated through the social signals of her world rather than through any public statement. What the interview represented, in Elizabeth's framework, was the definitive confirmation of the assessment she had made of Diana from the beginning. A woman who was properly formed for the institution would not have given that interview. The giving of it was the proof of the inadequacy that Elizabeth had identified 15 years earlier. That the interview was also the response of a woman who had been systematically isolated, emotionally abandoned, and institutionally managed into a position of desperation. That the desperation was, at least in part, the product of the institutional framework Elizabeth had spent her life building and sustaining, was not a dimension Elizabeth appears to have spent time examining. The examination would have required a form of self-knowledge that her formation had never produced and her position had never required. She had managed the institution's demands through strength rather than examining whether the demands were just, and the habit of 60 years is not disrupted by the suffering of one woman, however visible and however real. Diana died in Paris in August 1997. The institution's response to her death, and specifically the Queen's initial failure to provide the public acknowledgement of grief that the country was demanding, was the most acute institutional crisis the monarchy had faced since the abdication. It was resolved through the intervention of advisers who understood what the public needed and who had the access to the Queen to communicate that understanding in terms she could act on. Elizabeth's role in the immediate post-Diana period was managed rather than active. She was in her late 90s. The specific crisis was being handled by people operating in real time with the public pressure that real time demanded. Her influence remained present in the background, in the framework of institutional values that the Queen applied to every decision, but the immediate crisis management was beyond the scale at which her specific methods operated. What she did, in the years following Diana's death, was maintain the consistent silence about Diana that her method had always used for subjects that the myth required to remain unexamined. She did not speak publicly about Diana in ways that engaged with the reality of Diana's experience. She did not acknowledge the institutional failures that had contributed to that experience. She maintained the warm, composed, forward-looking surface of a woman who had decided that the story of Diana was a story that did not require her contribution. The silence was the statement. It was the same statement she had always made about the things that the myth could not accommodate. Diana had been, in the end, the most consequential of Elizabeth's enemies because she had been the one who had most directly threatened the myth from the inside, not through deliberate campaign, as Elizabeth's enemies usually threatened, but simply by being, publicly and visibly and unmistakably, a human being inside an institution that was not designed for human beings. The institution had not been able to contain her. Elizabeth had not been able to manage her. The specific qualities that had made Diana impossible to accommodate were the qualities that had made her beloved in a way that no management operation could replicate or replace. Elizabeth had outlived every other enemy. She outlived Diana too. But Diana's legacy, the specific change in public expectation of the monarchy that her presence and her suffering had produced, was the one thing Elizabeth's methods could not outlast. The myth had survived everything Elizabeth had managed. It did not in the end survive Diana. The most important thing to understand about Elizabeth's methods is that they were not a toolkit assembled in response to specific problems. They were a way of being in the world that had been developed so gradually and practiced so consistently that they had long since ceased to feel like methods at all, either to her or to the people she deployed them against. They were simply how she operated, as natural and as continuous as the warmth that was their primary surface expression, and the naturalness was itself the most important element of their effectiveness. A woman who is visibly strategic produces resistance. The people around her identify the strategy and develop responses to it. The resistance creates friction that slows the strategy's operation and sometimes prevents it from achieving its objectives. A woman whose strategy is invisible because it is indistinguishable from her personality, from the warmth and the ease and the genuine charm that constitute her social presence, produces no resistance because there is nothing visible to resist. The people she is moving encounter only the warmth, and the warmth produces the response she needs, and the response produces the outcome she intended, and the chain from intention to outcome leaves no visible links. Elizabeth's methods were invisible for most of her adult life because they were embedded in a personality that the world found genuinely appealing. She was not performing warmth over a cold substrate. She was a woman of genuine warmth who had learned, from childhood, to make that warmth work for specific purposes, and the fusion of genuine feeling and specific purpose was so complete that separating them was, for most practical purposes, impossible. The first and most fundamental of her methods was the management of her relationship with the Queen, and it was fundamental because everything else she accomplished operated through or alongside that relationship. Elizabeth's influence over the Queen was the primary instrument of her power in the institutional world, and it was an instrument she had been developing since 1952, and maintaining with uninterrupted consistency across the subsequent 50 years of the reign. The relationship was genuinely close. The Queen's love for her mother was real, demonstrated in the specific ways that the Queen demonstrated everything genuine in her life, quietly, consistently, without theatrical display. Elizabeth's love for the Queen was equally real, equally deep, and equally expressed through consistency rather than drama. The closeness was not manufactured for institutional purposes. It was the natural product of a mother-daughter relationship that had been formed in conditions of shared difficulty, the abdication, the war, the early death of George VI, that had deepened the bond beyond what ordinary proximity produces. The closeness was also, from Elizabeth's perspective, a resource. She understood its institutional value with the clarity that she brought to every assessment of assets and how they could be deployed. The Queen's trust in her mother's judgment was the most reliable leverage point in the institutional world, and Elizabeth used it with the care and the patience that its value demanded, not exploiting it crudely in ways that would have strained it, but cultivating it steadily, confirming it through the consistent provision of counsel that served the Queen's interests as well as her own, and deploying it at the specific moments when the deployment would determine outcomes that mattered. The cultivation was the key. She was not simply the beneficiary of the Queen's trust, she was the active maintainer of it, through decades of consistent behavior that confirmed the trust's basis. She gave advice that was sound. She provided support that was genuine. She managed her own conduct in ways that never gave the Queen reason to doubt her reliability or her judgment. The trust was earned as well as inherited, which made it deeper and more durable than a trust based simply on the accident of the relationship. The second method was the management of social atmosphere, which was the instrument she used most frequently and most consistently across the full range of her institutional activities. Social atmosphere is the invisible architecture of group behavior, the set of unspoken understandings that shape what can be said and done in a given social context, what positions are available to the people within it, what outcomes are possible, and which are foreclosed by the ambient pressure of shared expectation. Elizabeth managed social atmosphere with a precision that most people who experienced it never identified as management. She created, in every social context she inhabited, an atmosphere in which certain things felt natural and other things felt impossible, and she created it through the specific combination of her personal warmth and her social authority that produced a gravitational field around her presence. In practice, this meant that the gatherings she presided over, the lunches at Clarence House, the house parties at Royal Lodge, the informal occasions that were the actual texture of the royal family's internal social life, had a specific quality that reflected her preferences and her purposes. The topics that were discussed and the topics that were not discussed, the people who were included and the people who were excluded, the specific emotional register of the gathering and what it was comfortable expressing and what it was not. All of these were shaped by Elizabeth's presence in ways that the people present experienced as simply the character of the occasion rather than as the product of deliberate management. The people she wanted to influence came to those gatherings and left them having absorbed the signals she had embedded in the atmosphere. The courtiers who managed sensitive situations, the advisers who shaped policy on matters that touched her interests, the family members whose positions on important questions would determine outcomes she cared about. These people sat at her table, enjoyed her hospitality, experienced her warmth, and received, through the ambient communication of the atmosphere she had created, the understanding of how she thought about the relevant questions. The understanding was never delivered as instruction. It arrived as the natural consequence of time spent in her company, of the accumulated effect of what she said and how she said it and what she left unsaid, of the specific social signals that her world was fluent in and that she deployed with a native fluency that made them indistinguishable from ordinary conversation. The third method was the strategic use of vulnerability, and it is the method that requires the most careful examination because it is the one most at odds with the image of capability and strength that this account has been building. Elizabeth was not a woman who displayed vulnerability easily or often. The composure that defined her public presence was genuine in the sense that it reflected a real capacity to manage difficulty without being overwhelmed by it, and that capacity was one of the qualities that people who knew her most consistently remarked upon. She did not fall apart. She did not perform distress in the ways that people who use vulnerability manipulatively tend to perform it. But she understood vulnerability as a social instrument with specific applications, and she used it in those applications with the same precision she brought to every other tool in her operational toolkit. The applications were specific and limited. She did not deploy vulnerability broadly or routinely, which would have diluted its effectiveness and complicated her image as someone of settled strength. She deployed it in context where the appearance of vulnerability served a specific strategic purpose, and in those contexts she deployed it with complete conviction. The most important of those contexts was her relationship with the Queen in moments of institutional decision-making, where Elizabeth's preferred outcome required the Queen to feel that she was protecting her mother rather than following her counsel. A woman who gives advice from a position of visible strength is giving advice that the recipient can weigh against other advice and accept or reject based on its merits. A woman who gives the same advice from a position of apparent vulnerability is giving advice that the recipient feels obligated to follow out of the specifically powerful combination of love and protectiveness that a child feels for a parent who appears to need their support. Elizabeth understood this distinction with the precision of someone who had been managing the emotional dynamics of important relationships for 80 years. In the specific moments when her preferred institutional outcome required the Queen's active support rather than simply the absence of opposition. She could and did shift her register from the authority of experience to the appeal of a woman who had given her life to the institution and who needed its protection of the things she had given that life to sustaining. The shift was subtle. It was not a performance of helplessness. It was a modulation, a reduction in the projection of capability that was the normal register of her social presence, combined with a specific emotional signal about the stakes involved in the relevant decision. The Queen received the modulation, understood what it communicated, and responded with the protective instinct that the modulation was designed to activate. The fourth method was what might be called patient presence, the sustained maintenance of a position without forcing its resolution. Elizabeth never forced outcomes that time and sustained presence would produce without forcing. She understood, with the instinct of someone formed in a world that operated on generational timescales, that the most durable outcomes were the ones that arrived through the accumulated pressure of consistent positioning rather than through the shock of a single decisive intervention. The campaigns against Windsor's, against Mountbatten's dynastic ambitions, against Diana's rehabilitation within the institutional world, all of these were prosecuted through patient presence rather than dramatic action. She maintained her positions. She communicated them through the consistent management of atmosphere and relationship and access. She waited for the institutional world to absorb the positions and organize itself around them. The waiting was not passive. It was the active maintenance of a posture that required constant renewal and constant management of the specific relationships and channels through which her influence operated. But it was waiting in the sense that it did not require dramatic action, did not create the specific vulnerabilities that dramatic action generates, and did not produce the resistance that decisive interventions provoke. The fifth method was the smile itself, and the smile deserves specific analytical attention as a method rather than simply as a personality trait, because its function in Elizabeth's operational toolkit was more specific and more deliberate than the image of warm spontaneity suggests. The smile was a social cover, not in the sense of concealing something that was the opposite of warmth. The warmth was real, but in the sense of creating a visual and emotional signal that foreclosed the analytical response in the people who encountered it. A woman who is smiling that particular smile, that settled, serene, entirely untroubled expression of someone at complete ease with herself and her world, is a woman whose opponents cannot easily engage. The engagement requires a seriousness, a willingness to disturb the settled surface that the smile makes socially costly. Attacking someone who is smiling with that specific serenity makes the attacker look troubled and the target look composed, regardless of what the substance of the attack is or how well-founded it might be. The smile protected Elizabeth from the external challenges that her conduct might otherwise have attracted by making the challenge seem disproportionate to the surface it was directed at. The sixth method was the cultivation of the press, which was the institutional version of the access management she practiced with individuals. She understood the specific mechanics of the British royal press relationship with a sophistication that was not common among the royal family's members in the mid-20th century, and she used that understanding to shape her own coverage with a consistency that the coverage is apparent, spontaneity completely concealed. The editors and proprietors of the major British newspapers who moved through her social world in the relevant decades were people she knew personally, in the specific sense that her social hospitality had given her relationships with them that were warm, enough to carry the specific weight of obligation that personal relationships with powerful people carry. The relationships did not produce explicit agreements about coverage. They produced the ambient understanding, absorbed through hospitality and warmth, and the feeling of being genuinely valued by someone of Elizabeth's standing, that certain approaches to certain subjects were ones that the people in that social world did not take. The methods, assembled from their individual components into the complete operational picture they constituted, reveal a woman who was among the most effective practitioners of informal power in the 20th century British public life. Not because each individual method was remarkable in isolation. Each has parallels in the conduct of other powerful figures in other institutional contexts, but because the combination of them, maintained with such consistency and executed with such naturalness over such a long period, produced outcomes of a scope and a durability that the formal power available to her position could never have generated. She had no formal authority over the people she moved against. She could not issue orders. She could not make laws. She could not deploy the instruments of state. What she had was the informal power of a woman who occupied the specific position of being the Queen's mother in an institution where that position carried weight that no formal title could have replicated, and who had developed, from the raw material of her formation, a set of methods for exercising that informal power that were as sophisticated and as effective as anything that formal institutional power had produced in the same period. She used what she had. She used it brilliantly. The outcomes it produced were the outcomes she intended, delivered on timescales that her patience made possible, and through mechanisms that her method made invisible. The smile covered everything. The everything, examined carefully, was quite a lot. The public image of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Queen Consort and subsequently Queen Mother, is one of the most durable constructions in the history of modern celebrity, and its durability is the measure of its quality rather than simply the measure of its subject's actual qualities. Images of this kind, images that survive decade after decade, that absorb challenges without being complicated by them, that generate genuine affection in people who have never met their subject and know her only through the managed surfaces of media representation, do not produce themselves. They are built, maintained, and defended with the sustained effort and the professional sophistication that any durable construction requires. The building of Elizabeth's image began before she became royal and continued without significant interruption for the better part of 8 decades. The people who built it included professionals, courtiers, press secretaries, the editors and photographers and writers who populated the specific media world that covered royalty. But its primary architect was Elizabeth herself, who understood from the beginning of her public life what image she needed to project, and who participated in the projection with an active intelligence that the image's apparent naturalness was designed to conceal. The apparent naturalness was the foundational element. An image that looks constructed, which means it invites the analytical scrutiny that constructed things attract and that natural things do not. Elizabeth's image was effective precisely because it looked like the unmediated expression of a genuine personality rather than the output of a management process, and the looking like that was the most difficult and most important achievement of the construction. She accomplished it by ensuring that the genuine qualities she possessed were the qualities that the image was built around. She was warm. She was charming. She was funny in the specific way that people with genuine social intelligence and genuine pleasure in other people's company are funny. She was physically comfortable in the way that people who have never been troubled by self-consciousness are physically comfortable. She enjoyed the things the image said she enjoyed: the horses, the fishing, the racing, the gin, the social pleasure of a good lunch in good company. None of the primary materials of the image were invented. What was constructed was the emphasis and the omission. What the image emphasized was real. What it omitted was also real, and the omission was as carefully managed as the emphasis, because the qualities that would have complicated the image were qualities she genuinely possessed, and that required active management rather than simple non-disclosure. The construction began in earnest in the early years of her marriage to Albert, when the specific challenge she faced was the transformations from Scottish aristocrat's daughter to Duchess of York, in a public context that was beginning to develop the appetite for royal coverage that the mass media would subsequently expand to an industrial scale. The press of the 1920s was not the press of the 1950s in its scope or its intrusiveness, but it was already a force that shaped public understanding of the royal family in ways that the family had to engage with rather than simply ignore. Elizabeth's engagement with it was immediate and intelligent. She understood the press's needs. The photographs, the human interest material, the specific warmth that made royal coverage appealing to the readership rather than simply impressive to it, and she met those needs with a generosity and a calculated openness that produced exactly the coverage she wanted. She was photographed with her children. She was photographed at informal occasions in ways that communicated accessibility without actually providing access to anything that mattered. She gave the press the surface and withheld the substance, and the surface was appealing enough that the press was content with the arrangement. The Blitz is the single most important episode in the construction of Elizabeth's public image, and its importance is directly proportional to the degree to which its management was deliberate, rather than simply the natural expression of genuine courage. The courage was real. She did stay in London. She did visit bombed streets in her best clothes. She did project the specific composure under pressure that the wartime public needed from its royal family. She also understood exactly what those acts communicated and managed their communication with a sophistication that the spontaneity of the image was designed to obscure. The photographs of her visiting bomb sites were not accidental documentation of a woman about her wartime duties. They were the output of a deliberate approach to wartime royal image management that Elizabeth had developed in consultation with the palace's press operation, and that reflected a clear understanding of what the public needed to see and how it needed to see it. The specific decision to stay in London rather than move to the countryside, which has been documented as a genuine choice made in the face of advice that safety considerations warranted relocation, was a decision whose image dimensions Elizabeth had assessed alongside its personal and institutional ones. A queen who stayed in London while the city was being bombed was a queen whose courage was visible and whose solidarity with the bombed population was demonstrated rather than simply asserted. The visibility of the courage was the point as much as the courage itself, and the visibility was managed rather than incidental. The famous remark attributed to her after Buckingham Palace was bombed in September 1940, that she was glad the palace had been hit, because it meant she could look the East End in the face, is one of the most quoted lines in the construction of her wartime image, and its quotability is the measure of its effectiveness. Whether the remark was spontaneous or prepared, genuine in the moment of its expression or crafted for the effect it would produce, is a question that the available record does not definitively answer. What is clear is that it communicated exactly what the image required. A woman who understood solidarity and expressed it in terms that were warm and human rather than royal and formal. The post-war years brought a different challenge to the image because they brought a different public context. The austerity of the late 1940s and early 1950s created a social atmosphere in which conspicuous expenditure by the royal family was a potential liability, and the specific tensions between the monarchy's traditional lifestyle and the material conditions of a population managing the aftermath of an expensive war required management that was more delicate than the wartime management had been. Elizabeth's response to this challenge was the management of visibility rather than the management of behavior. She did not significantly reduce the expenditure or the lifestyle. She had always spent freely, and she continued to spend freely on the horses and the art and the food and the entertainment and the maintenance of the houses that her position required, and that her appetites enjoyed. What she managed was how much of this was visible to the public, whose conditions were so different from her own. The management was not perfect. The racing, which was both a genuine passion and a public activity that generated unavoidable coverage, created periodic tension between her image as a woman of warm solidarity and the reality of a woman who spent her Saturday afternoons at racecourses while her country was managing rationing. But the tension was managed well enough that it never produced the kind of sustained critical coverage that might have complicated the image, partly through the cultivation of press relationships and partly through the specific warmth of the racing world's coverage of her, which reflected both genuine affection and the specific management of access that the cultivation produced. The Royal Lodge years, from the late 1950s onward, gave the image its most settled and most durable form. The property in Windsor Great Park, which she had loved since her years as Duchess of York, and which she occupied from 1952 until her death in 2002, was the physical setting around which the mature version of the image was organized. The garden, the racing, the lunches, the fishing on the Dee at Balmoral, the specific pleasures of a woman in her element. The image of the Queen Mother in these years was the image that lodged most deeply in the public consciousness, and that her death in 2002 was mourning. It was an image of settled pleasure and settled warmth and settled ease, a woman who had been through everything that the 20th century had produced in terms of difficulty and loss and institutional pressure, and who had come through it with her serenity intact and her enjoyment of life undimmed. The serenity was real in its way. She had resolved the tensions of her position in ways that produced something that functioned like serenity. But the resolution had required the specific suppressions and the specific campaigns and the specific managements that this account has been documenting, and the serenity was not the simple product of a character at peace with itself, but the managed surface of a character that had decided, long ago, that management was the appropriate response to everything that threatened the surface. The specific people who maintained the image in its operational form during the post-war decades were the members of her household, whose professional function was the management of her public presentation. The ladies-in-waiting, the private secretary, the press secretary, these were people who served the image as well as the woman, who understood the distinction between the two, and whose professional skill was the maintenance of the gap between them in conditions that were sometimes difficult. Their maintenance of the gap was assisted by the specific culture of the palace world, in which the code of discretion was so deeply embedded and so consistently enforced that the information that would have complicated the image was contained not primarily through active management, but through the ambient social pressure of a world that simply did not discuss certain things. The debt is the most striking example of what the ambient culture contained. Elizabeth's personal finances were, for most of the second half of her life, in a condition of sustained deficit that would have been the subject of sustained public scrutiny if it had been attached to any other recipient of public money. She spent beyond her income. The deficit was covered through the financial architecture of the royal household in ways that distributed the cost across institutional budgets that were not subject to the specific public accountability that her personal expenditure would have attracted if it had been visible as such. The specific figure of her debt at the time of her death, reported in various accounts as somewhere between £4 and £7 million, was the accumulated product of decades of expenditure on the horses and the art and the staff and the houses and the specific pleasures that she had never considered reducing, because the consideration of reducing them was simply not part of her framework for managing her own life. The debt was known within the relevant institutional circles. It was not known publicly in any detailed or sustained way. The management that kept it from being publicly known was the management of a world that had powerful collective interests in maintaining the image, and that understood, with the specific intelligence of the institutionally self-interested, that the image was more valuable than the truth it was covering. The image was the institution's primary asset in its relationship with the public. The public's affection for the Queen Mother was a significant component of the monarchy's overall legitimacy in the second half of the 20th century. A public reckoning with the gap between the image and the reality would have cost the institution more than the specific embarrassments it would have produced, because it would have demonstrated the gap itself, the existence of a managed surface over a complicated reality, in ways that would have applied to every other element of the institution's public presentation. The interests were aligned, the image was maintained, the management continued. She died at the age of 101 on March 30, 2002, at Royal Lodge, with the Queen at her side. The public mourning was genuine and extensive. The lying-in state drew 200,000 people to Westminster Hall. The funeral was attended by dignitaries from across the world. The coverage was uniformly warm, uniformly celebratory of the image that had been built across 8 decades, uniformly organized around the idea of a woman who had been what she appeared to be. The myth machine had produced its final output. The image had held. The campaigns, the methods, the management, the information control, the patient prosecution of objectives across decades, all of it was beneath the surface that the 200,000 people were queuing to pay their respects to. The surface was the nation's grandmother. The surface was what they had loved. The surface had always been what they were meant to love. She had made sure of it. She had been making sure of it her entire life. The honest reckoning with Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon requires holding two things simultaneously that the standard frameworks for understanding her have consistently refused to hold together, because the holding of them simultaneously produces a picture that is more complicated and more interesting and more genuinely illuminating than either the official version or the revisionist one. The first thing is that she was genuinely extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the sense that the myth describes, the uncomplicated warmth, the nation's grandmother, the woman whose primary achievement was surviving everything with her smile intact, but extraordinary in the specific sense that the analytical account of her methods and her campaigns reveals. She was a woman of formidable intelligence and formidable will who operated in an institutional world that did not formally acknowledge women's power and who exercised more effective institutional influence than almost any formally powerful figure of her era. She did this across 8 decades, in conditions that changed dramatically around her, without ever losing the thread of her primary purposes or the patience to pursue them on the timescales they required. That is a genuine achievement. It requires genuine acknowledgement, not as a moral endorsement, but as an accurate assessment of what the evidence shows. She was very good at what she did. The quality of the operational intelligence she brought to every significant challenge of her institutional life was of a high order, and the sustained consistency with which she applied it across a century of public life has very few parallels in the history of the modern British monarchy. The second thing is that the people she moved against were people, not obstacles, not institutional problems to be managed. People with their own interior lives and their own claims on consideration and their own suffering that was real regardless of whether it served the institution's interests or Elizabeth's purposes. Wallis Simpson spent 65 years in a form of social exile enforced by the sustained exercise of institutional power. The Duke of Windsor died without the rehabilitation that might have given his long exile some retrospective dignity. Margaret gave up the relationship that mattered most to her and spent the rest of her life managing the cost of that giving up. Diana entered an institution that consumed her and found no one at its centre who was willing to ask whether the consuming was just. The suffering of each of these people was real. The degree to which Elizabeth contributed to the conditions of that suffering was real. The absence of any documented evidence that she spent significant time examining whether the contribution was justified, whether the institution's requirements actually outweighed the human costs of her campaigns in the way her framework assumed, is one of the most damning absences in the record. Holding both things simultaneously, the extraordinary capability and the human cost, is the only honest way to assess what Elizabeth was, and the assessment that emerges from holding them together is not the simple verdict that either framework produces. She was not a villain, which the revisionist account sometimes implies. She was not a saint, which the official account has always insisted. She was something considerably more specific and considerably more interesting than either of those categories accommodates. She was a woman who had made a total commitment to an institution and who prosecuted that commitment with every resource available to her across the full length of a very long life, and who found in the total nature of that commitment a resolution of the tension between self and purpose that was genuine enough to sustain her across every difficulty the commitment encountered. The resolution was real, the genuine conviction that motivated it was real, the warmth that expressed it was real. The resolution also required, as total commitments always require, the subordination of the competing claims that less total orientation would have acknowledged. The competing claims were the human realities of the people her commitment moved against, their suffering, their needs, their own legitimate interests in being treated as more than problems, to be managed in the service of an institutional logic they had not chosen and could not escape. She subordinated those claims consistently. She did it from genuine conviction rather than from coldness or cruelty, which makes it in some ways more rather than less troubling, because genuine conviction is harder to interrupt than personal failing. A woman who destroys enemies out of malice can be confronted with her malice and asked to reckon with it. A woman who destroys enemies out of genuine belief in the rightness of what she is doing has a response as to every challenge that the challenge cannot reach, because the response is the conviction itself, which is not modified by external argument. Elizabeth's conviction was not modified by external argument across 101 years of life that provided ample opportunity for modification. Every campaign she ran produced human cost that was visible to her. The cost was the payment the institution required in her framework, and the institution's requirements were the requirements that organized her world, and the organizing principle of her world was not available for reconsideration on the basis of the suffering it produced. That is the most honest description of what the smile was covering. Not wickedness, not the cold strategic calculation of a woman who enjoyed the exercise of power over other people, not the performance of warmth over an absent interior. The smile was covering a total commitment that had resolved the tension between self and institution so completely and so early that the tension itself had ceased to be visible to the woman who had resolved it. A woman who has resolved that tension completely does not experience the human costs of her institutional commitments as costs in the way that a person with an unresolved tension would. She experiences them as the natural and regrettable consequences of requirements that are simply the reality of the world she inhabits, in the same way that a soldier experiences the casualties of a war he believes is just, not without feeling, but without the specific moral uncertainty that would require him to stop and ask whether the war is actually just. Elizabeth never stopped to ask whether the war was just. The war for her was the monarchy. The monarchy was worth whatever it cost. The people it cost were people she was willing to pay with, not because she did not value them as people, but because she valued the institution more than she valued any individual within it, including herself. That is what the smile was covering, not nothing, not cruelty, a total commitment that had made the costs invisible to the person paying them with other people's lives. The institution she served with that commitment was the British monarchy, and the question of whether the institution was worth what she paid for it is a question that the institution itself has never been required to answer seriously. The monarchy's survival through the 20th century was in part Elizabeth's achievement. The human costs of that survival were, in part, Elizabeth's work. The accounting between those two facts has never been fully performed, partly because the myth machine she built was good enough to prevent the accounting from being required during her lifetime, and partly because the institution's continued survival after her death has not generated the conditions in which the accounting is more urgent than the continuation. The 6 enemies she destroyed are the 6 case studies in that accounting. They are the specific human faces of the institutional cost, and the examination of each of them reveals the same underlying structure. The institution's requirements assessed as paramount, the individual's claims assessed as secondary, the assessment executed with the specific methods she had developed and the specific patience she had cultivated, and the outcomes achieved with the consistency of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that the assessment was wrong. She destroyed Wallis Simpson's social position and the Duke of Windsor's hope of rehabilitation. She contained Mountbatten's dynastic ambitions and managed his influence into a permanent secondary status. She shaped the conditions in which Margaret gave up Townsend and spent 50 years managing the cost. She cultivated the institutional framework within which Diana found no accommodation and in which the institution found no obligation to provide it. She managed the information about herself with a thoroughness that prevented any challenge to the myth from reaching the public in a form that required response. 6 campaigns, 6 outcomes, all of them the outcomes she intended. The consistency of the outcomes across 65 years of institutional life against targets as different as a twice-divorced American socialite and the daughter-in-law of her granddaughter's generation is the measure of her capability. The human cost attached to each outcome is the measure of the commitment that capability served. The British public's love for the Queen Mother was genuine, and it was based on genuine qualities that she genuinely possessed. She was warm. She was funny. She was good company. She was present in the specifically admirable way that public figures who do not shirk from the requirements of their positions are present, and the requirements of her position during the war years and beyond were requirements she met with real fortitude and real grace. The love was not wrong. The qualities that generated it were real. The image that sustained the love across decades was built on a real foundation. The foundation was also built on the 6 campaigns, and the methods, and the myth machine, and the total commitment that resolved the tension between self and institution so completely that the tension never surfaced in public, in a form that required the public to reckon with it. The reckoning has been deferred. It is performed here, the specific sense that this account has assembled what the public record supports and examined it with the honesty that Elizabeth's own methods always prevented from being applied to her during her lifetime. The assessment is this: she was one of the most effective practitioners of informal institutional power in the history of the modern British monarchy. She was also a woman whose total commitment to that institution made her capable of prosecuting 6 sustained campaigns against 6 specific people with a consistency and a patience and a thoroughness that caused genuine and lasting damage to each of them. The capability and the damage were not separate things. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. The smile covered all of it. The smile was the cover for the capability, which was the cover for the commitment, which was the cover for the damage, which was the price the institution required, and that she paid, consistently and without hesitation, with other people's lives. She was 101 years old when she died, and the institution she had given her life to was still standing, and the image she had built was still intact, and the people she had moved against were gone, and the accounting was still deferred. She had won everything she had set out to win. The winning had cost everything she had chosen to pay. Whether the cost was worth it is a question that the institution she served has never been required to answer. It has not been required to answer it yet. The figure that appears in the most reliable accounts of Elizabeth's financial situation at the time of her death in 2002 is approximately £4 million. That is the estimated size of the overdraft she had accumulated at Coutts, the bank that has served the British royal family for centuries, and whose discretion about the financial affairs of its most significant clients is as much a part of its institutional identity as its address on the Strand. £4 million, an overdraft at 101 years old, after a lifetime of pubs that the nation had funded through the civil list, through the financial architecture of the royal household, through the specific mechanisms of institutional support that the monarchy provides its members in ways that are never fully transparent to the public whose money ultimately underwrites them. The number requires context to be understood accurately, and the context requires honesty about the specific financial culture of the royal world that Elizabeth inhabited and that she never seriously attempted to operate outside of. She was not a woman who worried about money in the way that people who do not have enough of it worry about money. She was a woman who spent money in the way that people who have never been required to connect their spending to their income spend money. As if the connection were someone else's problem, as if the bills were a practical matter to be managed by the people whose job it was to manage practical matters rather than a constraint that should shape her choices. The choices she made across 8 decades of post-wedding expenditure reflected this orientation with remarkable consistency. She bought art, she bought racehorses, she maintained houses. She employed staff at levels that her official income did not straightforwardly support. She entertained with a generosity that was genuine and warm and also very expensive, and she did all of it without the specific anxiety that financial constraint normally produces in people who are spending beyond their means, because the means were never the operative variable in her financial decision-making. The art collection is the most striking element of the financial picture, because it is the element that most clearly reveals the specific nature of the financial detachment that characterized her approach to money. She collected art seriously and with genuine connoisseurship. Her eye was good, her knowledge was real, and the collection she assembled over decades was one of genuine quality that reflected genuine engagement with the work, rather than simply the accumulation of expensive objects for the purposes of display. She also spent on art at levels that bore no relationship to her available income, financing purchases through a combination of the overdraft at Coutts, informal arrangements with dealers who understood that payment would be slow and irregular, and the specific institutional cover that her position provided for expenditure that would have been straightforwardly problematic if it had been attached to anyone without her specific combination of royal status and royal family support. The racing was the other major expenditure, and it was the one that generated the most public visibility because it was conducted in public by definition. She owned racehorses throughout her adult life, and the ownership was both a genuine passion and a significant ongoing expense. The training fees, the entry fees, the staff, the travel, the infrastructure of a serious racing operation. These were costs that ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds annually and that her civil list income did not straightforwardly cover. The civil list payments that Elizabeth received as Queen Mother were not trivial. In the final years of her life, she was receiving approximately £643.00 per year from the civil list, a figure that reflected the political negotiations between the palace and the government about the appropriate level of public support for the non-working members of the royal family. The figure was not small by any ordinary standard. It was insufficient for the life she was living, which is perhaps the most concise statement of her financial situation available. She was receiving over £500,000 a year from the public purse and running a multi-million-pound overdraft. The gap between those two facts is the measure of the financial reality that the image of serene, above-it-all royalty was covering. The covering was managed through several mechanisms that operated simultaneously, and that reflected the specific financial architecture of the royal world. The first was the Coutts overdraft itself, which was maintained by the bank as a service to a client whose position made the accommodation both commercially sensible in the long term and institutionally difficult to withdraw in the short term. A bank does not call in the overdraft of the Queen Mother. The political and reputational cost of such an action would have vastly outweighed the financial benefit, and Coutts understood this with the clarity of an institution that had been managing the money of powerful people for long enough to understand the specific constraints that powerful people's positions placed on normal commercial logic. The second mechanism was the informal financial support that flowed from the royal household's broader financial architecture in ways that were not documented as direct payments to Elizabeth, but that had the same practical effect. The maintenance of Royal Lodge, for example, was a cost that was distributed across the household's accounts in ways that reduced Elizabeth's personal financial exposure for the property she lived in, and that would have otherwise been a significant additional drain on resources that were already stretched. The third mechanism was the specific accommodation that the Queen provided for her mother's financial situation in ways that reflected both genuine love and the institutional necessity of preventing the Queen Mother's debt from becoming a public scandal that would have damaged the monarchy's reputation and complicated its relationship with the government that voted the civil list payments. The Queen's awareness of her mother's financial situation is not documented in the specific terms that would allow a precise account of what she knew and when she knew it and what she did about it. What is documented across multiple accounts of the period from people close to both women is a general understanding in the palace world that Elizabeth's finances were a managed problem rather than a resolved one, and that the management was the collective responsibility of the people whose institutional interests were served by preventing the problem from becoming visible. The art collection's value was, by the time of Elizabeth's death, considerable. The works she had acquired over decades, including significant pieces by Augustus John, Walter Sickert, and a number of important works in other categories, had appreciated in ways that partly offset the debt against which they had been implicitly secured. The collection passed to the Queen at Elizabeth's death as part of the estate's management, adding to the royal collection in ways that were not subject to the inheritance taxes that would have applied to a private estate of equivalent value. The tax arrangements around the royal family's estates and collections are a subject of consistent public interest and consistent institutional opacity, and Elizabeth's financial situation at the time of her death sits within that opacity in ways that prevent a fully precise accounting. What the available evidence supports is the conclusion that the financial reality of her life, the spending, the debt, the institutional cover that prevented the spending and the debt from generating public accountability, was as comprehensively managed as every other reality that conflicted with the image she had spent 8 decades constructing. The management was effective in its primary purpose, which was preventing the financial reality from damaging the image during her lifetime. She died with the image intact. The debt was managed through the estate in ways that the palace's financial machinery made possible. The art collection enriched the royal collection. The racing empire wound down. The overdraft was resolved through the mechanisms available to people whose deaths produce estates rather than simply liabilities. The racing is worth a final specific examination because it was the dimension of Elizabeth's financial life that was most visible, that required the most sustained management to prevent its costs from becoming a public issue. She was associated with racing throughout her adult life, and the association was genuine. She understood horses with a depth that reflected decades of serious engagement rather than the superficial enthusiasm that public figures sometimes attach to activities they find useful for image purposes. The racing operation she maintained was serious and sustained. She owned horses that ran at the highest levels of British racing, and the operation of that kind of stable, the trainers, the staff, the horses themselves, the infrastructure, was a professional undertaking whose costs were at the level of a significant small business. She funded it through the combination of prize money, which was real but variable, the civil list income that was supposed to cover her official activities, and the debt that accumulated in the gap between what the operation cost and what those two sources provided. The racing world knew Elizabeth's financial situation with the general accuracy of a world that operates on personal relationships and shared knowledge. The trainers who worked with her horses, the owners she encountered at meetings, the officials who moved through the same circuit, these were people who understood, without discussing it explicitly, that the Queen Mother's racing was funded through arrangements that were not entirely conventional, and that the arrangements were maintained by the specific institutional cover of her position. The cover held, the racing continued. The image of the nation's grandmother, watching her horses run at Cheltenham and Sandown, was one of the most enduring and most beloved elements of the public presentation, and the financial reality behind it was as invisible to the public watching those races as every other reality that Elizabeth's management had made invisible. What the financial story adds to the overall picture of Elizabeth is not a new category of failing, but a new dimension of the same essential dynamic that runs through every other element of her story. She operated within a framework of institutional protection that exempted her from the normal consequences of choices that would have been consequential for anyone outside that framework. The spending without accountability was the financial version of the power without accountability that ran through every other dimension of her institutional life. The debt was the financial version of the costs that her campaigns imposed on other people, a cost that was real and that someone was going to pay, but that the institutional machinery ensured would not be paid by Elizabeth herself. She had been paying with other people's resources her entire life, with other people's suffering in her campaigns, with other people's money in her finances. The consistency across both domains is the consistency of a woman whose position had always placed her outside the specific constraint of personal consequence, and who had organized her life, consciously or not, around the specific freedom that the absence of that constraint provided. The nation mourned her with genuine warmth when she died. The mourning was for the image, which was real in its way, and for the qualities that the image was built on, which were also real. The debt was not part of the mourning. The financial reality was not part of the coverage. The gap between the image and the reality was maintained in death, as it had been maintained in life. She would have expected nothing less. She had been managing that gap since before most of the people managing it at her death had been born. She had been very good at it. The nation's overdraft of affection for her, accumulated across 8 decades of the image's operation, was the one debt she left behind that no one was going to call in. The question of legacy is always the question that resists the cleanest answer, because legacy is not a single thing. It is the sum of effects produced by a life on the world that continues after that life ends, and the effects of a life, as long and as consequential as Elizabeth's, were distributed across too many domains and too many people and too many institutional context to resolve into a single verdict. What she left behind was multiple and contradictory, and in some respects still unfolding, and the honest accounting of it requires the same holding of contradictory truths simultaneously that the honest accounting of her life has required. Throughout, the institution she left behind was, in the most immediately measurable sense, the primary achievement of her legacy and the primary justification for everything she had done in its service. The British monarchy in 2002 was standing. It had survived the abdication crisis that had threatened it in 1936, the wartime pressures that had tested it through the early 1940s, the social changes of the post-war decades that had eroded the deference that monarchy traditionally relied on, the various personal scandals of the 1980s and 1990s that had complicated its public standing, and the acute crisis of Diana's death in 1997 that had momentarily made the institution's survival genuinely uncertain. It had survived all of those things, and it was still standing in 2002, and the survival was partly Elizabeth's work, not entirely hers. The Queen's own conduct across the reign had been the primary institutional stabilizer, and the broader social and political conditions that sustained the monarchy through the 20th century were not conditions that any individual had created. But Elizabeth's specific contribution to the survival was real and substantial, and the specific forms it took were forms that the institution's official history has never fully acknowledged, because acknowledging them would require acknowledging the methods through which the contribution was made. The Wallis campaign had prevented the rehabilitation of the Windsors in ways that the institution benefited from. A rehabilitated Wallis, received at court, granted the HRH, integrated back into the family's public life, would have been a sustained complication of the monarchy's relationship with its own history, a permanent reminder of the abdication and its specific meanings in ways that the managed exile had prevented. Elizabeth's campaign had kept the complication contained, and the institution had benefited from the containment. The management of Mountbatten's dynastic ambitions had prevented the specific institutional disruption that a successful Mountbatten campaign would have produced. The House of Windsor remained the House of Windsor. The specific dynastic identity that the name represented was preserved. The institution had benefited from that preservation in ways that were visible in the Queen's relationship with her own identity and the public's relationship with the monarchy's continuity. The management of the Townsend affair had prevented the specific constitutional complication that a Margaret and Townsend marriage would have produced, and had done so through mechanisms that placed the resolution outside the institution's formal constitutional machinery rather than inside it, which protected the institution from the kind of precedent that a formal constitutional resolution would have created. Each of these was a genuine institutional service. The service was real, the cost of the service was also real, and the people who paid the cost were people rather than abstractions, and their payment of it was not made with their consent or with any acknowledgement from the institution that the payment was being extracted. That is the specific quality of what Elizabeth left behind in institutional terms. A strengthened institution built partly on the suppressed claims of the people her campaigns had moved against. The strength and the suppression were not separable. The institution was stronger because of the suppression. The suppression caused suffering that the institution never acknowledged. The legacy in personal terms, the legacy she left to the family she had shaped and in some cases defined, is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing than the institutional legacy, because it is the legacy that most directly reveals the human cost of the total commitment that was her life's organizing principle. The Queen's legacy as a monarch was shaped in its essential character by Elizabeth's influence in ways that have been acknowledged in the general sense, but never examined in the specific one. The Queen's instinct toward institutional caution, her preference for the managed response over the human one, her specific difficulty with the personal dimensions of institutional situations that required both personal and institutional responses. These were qualities that the Queen brought to her reign that had been cultivated in her by her mother's consistent example and her mother's consistent counsel. When the Queen failed Diana in the specific ways that the record documents, failure to provide personal support, during the marriage difficulties, the management of the public response to Diana's death in ways that prioritized institutional image over human acknowledgement. Those failures reflected the institutional framework that Elizabeth had been the primary cultivator of. The Queen was not simply failing to be warm. She was applying the framework that her formation had given her, the framework in which the institution's requirements were the primary reference point and individual claims were assessed against those requirements, rather than on their own terms. Elizabeth had given the Queen that framework. She had given it through decades of example and counsel, and the specific cultivation of the Queen's instinct toward the institutional outcome that her own life's commitment required. The framework had served the institution. It had cost Diana everything. The chain of responsibility from Elizabeth's formation of the Queen to Diana's experience of the institution the Queen ran was real, even if the links in the chain were invisible to most of the people inside it. Margaret's legacy in the family is the most painful element of what Elizabeth left behind in personal terms, because Margaret's life was the most direct evidence of the human cost of her mother's priorities. The woman who gave up Townsend in 1955 spent the subsequent 4 decades managing the specific damage of that giving up, the marriage to Armstrong Jones that was real in its early years and painful in its later ones. The drinking that was the self-medication of a woman in chronic emotional pain, the specific quality of her public life, as someone who had been required to pay a price she had not chosen and who had never been offered by the institution or by her mother any acknowledgement that the price had been too high. Elizabeth's relationship with Margaret in the post-Townsend decades was warm in its surface expression and present in its practical dimensions. She was there, she was attentive, she demonstrated the maternal care that her position and her feeling for her daughter made available. She did not, in any documented form, acknowledge the specific thing she had done in the Townsend affair or the cost that it had extracted from the person she had done it to. The acknowledgement was not forthcoming because acknowledging it would have required her to reconsider the framework that had produced the decision, and the framework was not available for reconsideration. The institution had required the sacrifice had been made. The cost was regrettable, but the regret did not generate the specific acknowledgement that would have required her to locate herself as its cause. Margaret's final years were marked by the specific accumulation of the costs that her life had been running up since 1955. The strokes, the health difficulties, the progressive physical decline of a woman whose relationship to her own body had been complicated by decades of substance use that was itself the consequence of the emotional damage that the Townsend decision had produced. She died in February 2002, 6 weeks before Elizabeth, and the specific timing meant that Elizabeth spent the last weeks of her own life having outlived the daughter, whose unhappiness had been partly her making. Whether she spent those weeks in any form of reckoning with her role in that unhappiness is not something the available record addresses. The accounts of people close to her in the final weeks describe a woman whose physical decline was significant but whose mental presence remained, and who spent time with the family members who came to Royal Lodge in the way that a woman of 101 spends time with the people she has loved across a century. The reckoning, if it happened privately and left no trace. The institution she had served was still standing. The daughter she had sacrificed to its requirements was gone. The campaigns she had prosecuted were complete. The myth she had built was intact. The debt was being managed. The legacy was the sum of all of it, held together by the same intelligence and the same patience and the same total commitment that had produced each of its elements across the full length of a life that had been, in its specific way, one of the most consequential of the 20th century. What the legacy tells us about the institution is perhaps its most important dimension, because institutions outlast individuals, and the conditions that a single person creates within an institution can persist long after the person who created them is gone. The conditions Elizabeth created within the British monarchy were the conditions of a managed surface over a complicated reality, sustained by the specific mechanisms she had developed and by the institutional culture she had helped shape, in which those mechanisms were simply the way things were done rather than choices that could be made differently. The management of information. the cultivation of the Queen's instincts, the social atmosphere of the palace world and its specific pressure toward discretion and institutional caution, the code that prevented the people inside the world from telling the truths that the image required to remain untold. These conditions were still operating in the institution after her death because they had been built into its culture deeply enough that they did not require her presence to continue. The specific campaigns she had run were over. The culture that had made them possible was still there, expressed through different people in different contexts, but organized around the same fundamental logic. The institution's requirements were paramount, individual claims were secondary, the surface was to be maintained, and the reality was to be managed. That culture produced, in the years after Elizabeth's death, the specific institutional responses to specific institutional crises that reflected its continued operation. The management of the Andrew situation across the Epstein years, the handling of Harry and Meghan's decision to step back from royal duties, and the specific institutional response to their subsequent public accounts of their experience. The ongoing management of the monarchy's relationship with its own history in relation to empire and colonialism. In each of these contexts, the institutional logic that Elizabeth had been the primary cultivator of was visible in the specific forms that the institutional response took. The prioritization of image over acknowledgement, the management of information rather than the engagement with its substance, the consistent choice of the surface over the reality. She had built well. The building outlasted her. The building will likely outlast the current generation of the people inside it. The question of whether what she built was worth building, whether the institution she helped sustain across the 20th century deserved the sustaining, whether the human costs of that sustaining were justified by the institutional benefits, whether the 6 campaigns and the financial architecture and the myth machine and the total commitment were the right way to spend 100 years of extraordinary capability, is a question that the institution she left behind has no mechanism for answering honestly, because the mechanism for answering it honestly would require exactly the kind of reckoning with the gap between surface and reality that her methods were specifically designed to prevent. The reckoning is deferred, as it has always been deferred, by the same institutional logic that deferred it during her lifetime. The image endures, the affection endures. The nation's grandmother remains the nation's grandmother in the collective memory, warm and serene and smiling the smile that covered everything, the everything examined here with the honesty that her own methods never permitted during her lifetime, was the full complexity of a woman who was extraordinary and damaging in equal measure, who served an institution with a totality that left no room for the competing claims that totality requires you to suppress, and who left behind a world that was shaped by her capability and marked by her costs simultaneously. The smile covered all of it, it covers it still. The institution she built it for is still standing behind it. That was always what she intended. She got exactly what she intended. The price was paid by the people this account has named. They paid it so the smile could hold. It held. It is holding still. Elizabeth died in March 2002, having lived long enough to watch 4 granddaughters grow into adult women into the institution she had spent a century shaping. Zara Phillips, the daughter of Anne and Mark Phillips, was 21. Beatrice and Eugenie, the daughters of Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, were 13 and 12 respectively. Louise, the daughter of Edward and Sophie, was not yet 2. A 5th granddaughter, Lady Sarah Chatto, the daughter of Margaret, was 38 and had spent her adult life managing the specific inheritance of being Margaret's child in ways that reflected the costs of the Townsend decision more directly than any other member of the generation. The world these women were born into and were growing up in was the world Elizabeth had built. The institution with its specific logic, its specific culture, its specific management of the gap between surface and reality, its specific understanding of what women within it were for and what they were required to suppress in service of what they were for. That logic had shaped Elizabeth's own life completely and had shaped the Queen's life almost as completely, and the question of what it would do to the generation that followed them was a question that Elizabeth's death left open in ways that her life had not. The granddaughters inherited different versions of the institutional logic depending on their specific position within the family's hierarchy, their parents' relationship to the institution, and the degree to which the world outside the palace walls had changed enough by the time they were forming their adult identities to offer them frameworks for understanding their own situations that Elizabeth's generation had never had access to. Zara Phillips was in some respects the granddaughter who most clearly demonstrated what the institution looked like when Scott's grip was loosened by the accident of position rather than challenged by deliberate choice. She was not in the line of succession in any meaningful sense. Her mother Anne, who had been offered a peerage for her children and had declined it, had given Zara a freedom from formal royal obligation that was unusual in the family's structure, and that produced, in Zara's adult life, something that looked more like an ordinary existence than anything the previous generation of royal women had been permitted. She pursued sport seriously. She became a world champion equestrian, winning the European Eventing Championship in 2005 and the World Championship in 2006, achievements that were hers rather than the institution's, and that were evaluated on the terms that sporting achievement is evaluated on rather than on the terms of royal performance. She married Mike Tyndall, a rugby player, in 2011, in a wedding that was warm and celebratory and notably free of the institutional weight that royal weddings carry when they involve people closer to the center of the family's constitutional significance. The freedom Zara had was real, but it was the freedom of someone who had been placed outside the institution's primary orbit by the specific accident of her mother's position and her mother's choices, not the freedom of someone who had examined the institution's logic and found it wanting and chosen a different one. The examination, the choice, the deliberate construction of an alternative, these were not available to the granddaughters who were inside the orbit, and the distinction between Zara's freedom and her cousin's constraint is one of the most revealing things about how the institution Elizabeth built actually operated on the women inside it. Beatrice and Eugenie were inside the orbit in the specific way that the daughters of a senior royal are inside it, not as working members with formal constitutional functions, but as women whose identity was defined by their proximity to the institution in ways that made it impossible to simply opt out of the institutional logic while remaining inside the family. They were princesses, they were the Queen's granddaughters, they were Andrew's daughters, which gave them a specific additional complexity that the Epstein story subsequently made unavoidable. Their childhood and adolescence were conducted in the conditions that Sarah Ferguson's post-divorce life had created. The Royal Lodge household, the two homes, the parents who remained in each other's orbit without being in each other's marriage, the specific emotional complexity of a family structure that was neither conventional divorce nor conventional marriage, but something in between that, required constant navigation. Elizabeth's presence in that family structure, as the grandmother who was also the institution's embodiment, was a constant gravitational force in their formation in ways that have never been examined with the analytical attention they deserve. She was warm to Beatrice and Eugenie in the way she was warm to everyone she wanted to remain close to, which was genuinely and with the specific quality of warmth that made people feel seen and valued. She was also the primary representative of the institutional logic that had produced the conditions of their parents' situation, the institution that had taken their father's HRH from their mother, that had managed the Ferguson marriage and its failure in the ways that the management of such things required, that had created and then dismantled the structure within which their family had existed. They grew up inside that paradox without, for much of their early lives, having the framework to identify it as a paradox. Elizabeth was their grandmother. The institution was simply the world. The relationship between the two was not something children examine in the way that adult analysis requires. What they absorbed, through the specific conditions of their formation, was a version of the institutional logic that was more complicated and less complete than the version Elizabeth had absorbed at Glamis, because their world contained more contradictions than her world had contained, and because the external culture in which their formation was happening was a culture that provided, increasingly, alternative frameworks for understanding the situations they were navigating. The alternative frameworks were the most significant difference between Elizabeth's generation and her granddaughter's generation, and the significance of that difference is the most important element of her legacy's relationship to the women who came after her. Elizabeth had been formed in a world where the institutional logic was essentially total, where the gap between the institution's requirements and an individual's claims was always resolved in the institution's favour, not because the individual had examined the competing claims and found the institution stronger, but because the culture provided no serious framework for the individual claim to be made in the first place. You did not assert your individual needs against the institution's requirements. The assertion was not available as a move. The institutional logic was the only logic in the relevant world. By the time Beatrice and Eugenie were forming their adult identities in the 2000s and 2010s, that totality had fractured in ways that were visible in the broader culture and that penetrated even the palace world's specific management of the culture's influence on its members. Therapy existed as a normal resource rather than a stigmatized one. The language of emotional needs and psychological health and the legitimate claims of individual well-being had become available in ways that it had not been available to Elizabeth or to the Queen. The specific idea that an institution might owe something to the individuals it contained, rather than simply requiring things from them, was a framework that the culture now offered and that the previous generation had not had. Beatrice and Eugenie grew up in that altered cultural landscape, while simultaneously growing up inside an institution that was still organized around the older logic, and the tension between the two was a formative pressure that produced, in both of them, adult women who were visibly navigating something that Elizabeth's generation had not been required to navigate: the question of how to be themselves inside an institution that was asking them to suppress themselves in ways that the culture outside it was telling them were neither necessary nor just. The navigation produced different outcomes in each of them. Beatrice's public profile in the years following her grandmother's death reflected a woman working out the relationship between her royal identity and her individual one in real time and in public, with the specific difficulty that the process of working it out was itself subject to the institutional management that shaped everything involving the family's public presentation. Eugenie's decision to speak publicly about her scoliosis surgery, about her mental health, about the specific human realities of her life inside the institution, was a departure from the management culture that Elizabeth had built and maintained across 8 decades that would have been unthinkable in Elizabeth's framework, not because Elizabeth would have actively prevented it. The specific question of whether to speak about scoliosis surgery was not a question that Elizabeth's operational toolkit was designed to address. But because the impulse to speak about it, the framework that said personal truth-telling was valuable and that individual experience deserved public acknowledgement, was an impulse that Elizabeth's formation had not contained and that her institution was not designed to accommodate. The speaking was the crack in the surface. Not the only crack, and not the largest one, but a crack that reflected the specific change in what the institution's younger members believed they were owed and what they believed the surface required of them. Lady Sarah Chatto, Margaret's daughter, occupies a different position in this account of the granddaughters, because her specific inheritance was the most direct possible connection to the human cost of Elizabeth's methods. She was the child of the woman whose happiness Elizabeth had sacrificed to the institution's requirements, and she had grown up watching the specific forms that her mother's managed unhappiness took across the decades of the post-Townsend period. Sarah Chatto has maintained, throughout her adult life, a public reticence that reflects the palace world's code of discretion at its most complete. She does not give interviews. She does not speak publicly about her mother or her grandmother or the specific things she knows about the relationship between the two women and the institution they inhabited together. She lives a private life of genuine artistic engagement. She is a painter of real ability and manages her royal connection with a discretion that Elizabeth would have recognized and approved of. Whether the discretion is the expression of genuine preference or the internalization of the institutional code that shaped her formation is a question that only she can answer. What is visible is a woman who carries the specific inheritance of her mother's story in a silence that the code of her world has always required, and who has maintained that silence across the decades since her mother's death in ways that reflect the depth of the institutional formation that Elizabeth's legacy produced. The Harry and Meghan situation, which developed in the years after Elizabeth's death, and which became the most acute expression of the generational fracture within the royal family, is not directly about the granddaughters, but it is about the same underlying dynamic that the granddaughters' stories reflect. The collision between the institutional logic Elizabeth had built and the alternative frameworks that the changed cultural landscape was offering to the people inside the institution. Meghan's experience of the institution, her account of it at least, as offered in the various public forums she has used since leaving, describes exactly the institutional culture that Elizabeth had been the primary cultivator of across 8 decades: the management of personal truth in service of institutional image, the suppression of individual emotional reality in service of the required public performance, the specific coldness of an institution that asks for total commitment and offers, in return, the validation of position rather than the warmth of genuine care. Elizabeth had thrived in that culture because she had resolved the tension it created through her total commitment to its logic. Meghan did not resolve it. She could not resolve it, partly because her formation was entirely outside the institutional world and its specific logic, and partly because the alternative frameworks available to her generation provided a vocabulary for naming what she was experiencing that made the resolution Elizabeth had achieved unavailable to her. The naming was the threat. Once the gap between the surface and the reality has a name, the surface becomes harder to maintain. Elizabeth had spent 8 decades preventing the gap from being named in public, and the institution she had built had developed, through her influence, a culture that was oriented toward exactly that prevention. The prevention failed, in the end, not because any single person defeated it, but because the cultural conditions that made it possible had changed in ways that the institution's internal management could not fully contain. The granddaughters who were formed inside those changed conditions were formed differently from the women who had come before them, and the difference expressed itself in the cracks that had been appearing in the managed surface since Elizabeth's death. She had built an institution for a world that was changing around it. She had built it brilliantly, with the full force of her extraordinary capability, and she had maintained it with a patience and a thoroughness that produced outcomes of remarkable durability. But durability is not permanence, and the conditions that had made the management possible were conditions that the century that produced them was already leaving behind. The granddaughters she left behind were the first generation inside the institution who had grown up with sufficient access to the alternative frameworks to ask, seriously, and with the language to sustain the asking, whether the surface was worth maintaining at the cost the maintaining required. Elizabeth had never asked that question. Her formation had not provided the language for it, and her commitment had not required it. The granddaughters were asking it. The institution had no answer that the management culture could contain. That was Elizabeth's real legacy, not the institution she had preserved, but the generation she had helped form, who were beginning, with the specific tools their changed world had given them, to ask whether the preservation had been worth what it cost, and whether the cost could continue to be extracted from the people inside the walls. The asking was the thing she had spent her entire life preventing. It was happening anyway. It was always going to happen eventually. The smile could not hold forever. Nothing does. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.